Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Iron Fanfics, back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Had Bejeweled Chimera Quirk. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Chapter 1. Izuku POV. Today was the day. Today was the day he would finally get to know what his quirk was. Maybe he would get a quirk like All Might's and be as powerful and brave as he is. The past few weeks had been rough, and Izuku's parents were finally going to the quirk doctor to get him sorted out, because what was happening was not normal, and they were worried something was wrong. While Izuku was definitely in discomfort, he couldn't understand why the adults kept stressing about it so much. He was getting a quirk. 2 weeks ago, right after his 5th birthday, it had started out innocently enough, with Izuku waking up one morning with some slight back soreness. That then turned into aching all over his body, including his back, fingertips, and even face. It was all very new sensations for him, especially his face. It was also weird how he kept accidentally biting his tongue, which never used to happen before. He told his parents about it, and when they looked at his mouth, that's what finally spurred them to take him to the doctor. While they tried to keep a calm face around him, he overheard them talking in worried whispers about his teeth and how they looked abnormally large. But that sounded cool. Any quirk was cool, really. Inko POV. Inko was nervous to see what would come of this visit. Everything happening to Izuku did not seem to match either hers nor Hisashi's quirk. At first she'd thought Izuku was just being a little dramatic about some back soreness, but when he persisted complaining she looked him over, and that was when she realized she really needed to know what the heck was going on. Looking at Izuku's mouth was one thing. His canines seemed longer than they should, with some sort of abnormal shine to them, but his back was what worried her most. He'd asked her to massage his back for him, and she'd obliged. When she was doing it, however, she noticed there were 2 bumps forming over his shoulder blades, not quite yet noticeable from the outside, but she could feel them with her hands. She'd shared her concerns with Hisashi, and they both agreed to take him to the quirk doctor as soon as possible to get him checked out. Midoriya? A nurse called from the doorway. Inko stood up with Hisashi and ushered Izuku towards the nurse, following her to a quirk examination room. Inside, they met Dr. Tsubasa, who would be doing Izuku's examination today. He started off by asking basic questions about what symptoms Izuku had already been showing. Inko specifically mentioned being wary of what was on his back, so Dr. Tsubasa asked to see his back to take a look. When he saw Izuku's back, he immediately got a contemplating look on his face, which didn't exactly help Inko's nerves. He then asked to see their other concerns such as his teeth. After looking over Izuku's outward appearance, he took some blood samples and walked away to test his quirk factor, telling the Midoriyas to give them about 20 minutes to analyze it and then the results would come back. A stressful 20 minutes later, Dr. Tsubasa came back with a pleased look on his face. It seems that your son has a very interesting quirk, Mr. and Mrs. Midoriya. He says. It seems to be largely a transformation-type quirk, but with a bit of creation too. Inko, while happy for her son, looks like she's about to cry. How is this even possible? She asks. Neither me or my husband have quirks even remotely close to something like that. That would be because it seems to be a mutation of sorts. Sometimes the quirk factor mutates on its own and creates its own, brand new type of quirk. He patiently explained. While it's not the most common thing for me to encounter, I assure you nothing is wrong with your son. Even though she was still a little confused about how this happened, she was relieved to know that nothing was wrong with Izuku. Speaking of Izuku, he was sitting on the edge of his seat, clearly wanting to say something but not wanting to interrupt the adults. Inko caught his gaze and motioned for him to say what he wanted. What is my quirk though? Izuku blurted out excitedly. Dr. Tsubasa smiled at the boy before explaining what his quirk would most likely include. The first he was most sure of was that Izuku would have some animalistic features such as talons, sharp teeth, slitted eyes, and wings. Izuku's face absolutely lit up when he heard that he would get wings, and Inko would have been lying if she said it didn't make her proud to have a son with such an amazing quirk. Hisashi, on the other hand, looked a bit skeptical. I thought you said he had a creation and transformation quirk too? He asked. Yes, While we don't know exactly what those aspects of his quirk entails, it seems to have something to do with precious stones and animal transformations. The animal transformations are also why he has visible effects such as his wings. Tsubasa explained. To find out all the minute details of your quirk, he said, looking at Izuku, going to quirk counseling would probably be in your best interests, just so that you don't get any nasty surprises. Also, he continued, your body will probably continue to feel achy and sore until your quirk starts to show. If there seem to be any complications, especially with the wings on Izuku's back, please seek out a doctor immediately. With the appointment now over, the Midoriyas filled out all the paperwork needed and then left for home. I'm not having Izuku register his quirk just yet because I feel like it makes sense for him to go to quirk counseling and figure everything out about his quirk first and then name it. Time skipped to 4 years later. Izuku is 9. Izuku POV. It's been 2 years since Izuku's quirk showed itself, and he couldn't be happier. After the doctor's appointment, Izuku's parents immediately signed him up for quirk counseling that started the very next week. While it was boring at first, he later learned that while there, he could use his quirk as much as he wanted, which included flying. Oh, Izuku loved flying. If there wasn't such a thing as quirk laws, he probably wouldn't have touched the ground if he didn't have to. Izuku's wings came in shortly after his quirk appointment, and while small at first, were so pretty. They were primarily black feathers, but at the apex of the wing there was a hooked claw that underneath had golden feathers that trickled down into the black, creating a beautiful effect. But while he loved his wings, the Midoriyas had learned that that wasn't even the biggest part of his quirk. He supposed he could separate his quirk into 3 categories: the visible effects to him, the transformation, and the creation part. The visible part of his quirk did indeed include wings, talons, teeth, and different eyes like Dr. Tsubasa said. However, then came the creation section of his quirk. Certain parts of his body, like certain feathers, nails, and teeth, were made of precious stones. His teeth were made of diamond, and his nails he could change the gem and shape at will. The hooked claws on top of his wings were made of gold, and as were his gold-colored feathers. Despite them being gold, however, they were still very soft. Another aspect of his creation they figured out when Izuku was first trying to fly, and fell on the ground pretty badly and ended up hurting himself. As he started crying, the tears that came out hit the ground with a thunk. They had turned into tiny jewels. The last part of his quirk, and the part he knew the least about, was his transformation. Izuku had the ability to transform into a cat. Well, that was really only part of it, and he'd only managed it once, and even then it was an accident. The quirk counselor said that, hypothetically, he should be able to turn into at least 3 different kinds of animals, because of all the mutations he naturally had on the outside. She suspected that one of these animals would be some kind of bird, but they weren't able to tell what kind just yet, because Izuku's wings still didn't have all their adult feathers, and most likely wouldn't for a while. All in all, Izuku decided to name his quirk Bejeweled Chimera, which his mother had said was a bit of a mouthful, but he didn't care and thought it fit quite nicely. School was probably one of the most interesting parts of Izuku's day. While he wasn't able to fly, he actually liked learning, and he loved seeing other people's quirks. One day, his big dream was to be a hero, like All Might. Maybe even better. Or actually, better not say that last part out loud in case Kaken heard him. Izuku and Kaken had been friends ever since they were little, because their mothers had been very close, but as they grew up, they also grew apart. Izuku grew to dislike Kaken for always using his quirk to scare other kids and was always 3 seconds away from not just exploding those around him, but also exploding in anger. He needed professional help. Professional was a word that Izuku learned recently, and he decided he liked it very much. He also decided he liked his life very much, so he didn't repeat any of these thoughts out loud to Kaken. Despite how cool Izuku thought his own quirk was, it seemed the students around him didn't think as much, and while none were straight up rude to him, they did somewhat alienate him by not including him in typically everyday activities. Not that he minded much, he actually liked the quiet. It gave his brain time to rest and think about all the possibilities his quirk had. After school, Izuku was walking home just like he did every day, when he heard someone call out to him from behind. He turned around, expecting someone he knew, but instead it was just some guy. The guy was very polite and explained that he wasn't from around here and needed help finding his way around. If Izuku thought it was a little strange that the man asked a 9-year-old and not an actual adult for directions, he didn't say anything. He quickly directed the man where he wanted to go, but before he left the man called out and asked him what his quirk was. Izuku didn't think much of it and so he just told the man its name and moved on with his day. Bad move. Apparently, when your mom tells you about stranger danger, she's not kidding, because just a few days later he's in quite the sticky situation. Izuku was walking home from school, like always, when is called out to yet again by the same man from before. This time, Izuku decides to ignore him, because despite him wanting to help, it was also getting dark and he needed to be home before dinner. The man doesn't stop however, and Izuku quickly becomes nervous and decides to make his way to a more populated area to try and shake the man away. Just a few feet away from a bustling main road, he sees a flash from the alley to his left, but when Izuku comes to, he can't see anything, but he tries to move around, and quickly realizes that his hands are literally tied. Then he remembers that he has claws that can be sharp as diamond. He makes quick work of the bonds, as clearly whoever took him wasn't smart enough to think, hey, maybe the kid with shiny claws can cut through rope. Just as he moves to take off the BNDFLD around his eyes, he hears a door open nearby and freezes. He can hear quiet voices talking about him. How much do you think this kid will sell for, huh? Voice number 1 says. Izuku decides to name him Mouse because of how quiet and low his voice sounds. Well, based on his quirk, he's probably going to be a big haul. Along with the wings, all those gems that are a part of him will probably be worth a pretty penny. Voice number 2 says. Izuku calls him Elmo because, well, that's what he sounds like. He almost laughs at the thought of a big red thing saying what Elmo here was. Another door opens and shuts on the other side of the room, so Izuku assumes that they left and had just been passing through. He then takes off his BLNDFLD and finally gets a good look at what's around him. He may only be 9, but he's not stupid. Sure, he's scared out of his mind right now, but he knows that if he wants to make it out of here, he has to be like the heroes in movies who are smart and cunning and quiet. He opens a door as quietly as he can and peeks out, making sure that no one was coming, then darting out and down the hall. Eventually, he found a window that showed him that he was in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, and that it was pitch dark outside. Oh no, his parents. They were probably so worried right now, he needed to find a way out of here immediately. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice the 3 people turning the corner to his hall. Eye contact was made. Everyone just seemed frozen for a second before the 3 thugs and Izuku sprang into action, the latter sprinting down the hall and turning random corners, just hoping that he somehow finds his way out. Behind him, the thugs were shouting at him to someone to catch him and for him to stop. Right? Izuku thought, I'll just stop and let the big scary kidnappers take me. Willingly. A 9-year-old, however, does not have the same speed and agility that 3 grown men who've most likely had extensive training. The thugs are quickly catching up to Izuku, grabbing at him while he tries desperately to evade. Izuku turns a corner and to his dismay, it's just one long hallway with a window at the end. As a last resort, he starts shouting for help at the top of his lungs, hoping that anyone will hear him and help. He continues running down the hall at top speed, the window getting closer every second when he gets an idea. He doesn't slow down, instead he speeds up as much as he can, using his wings to boost himself even more, and braces his body for impact. It's all he can do to hope that this window isn't reinforced because he would be in for a quick splat of an end if it was. He reaches the end of the hall and crashes through the window, glass slicing at the exposed skin on his body. Before he can fall, he spreads his wings and starts trying to fly away as fast as he can, but to his dismay it seems he underestimated how fast the thugs were. One of them had a thick meaty hand wrapped around his ankle, preventing him from getting very far. He's pulled back into the hallway and thrown to the floor, which shocks him for a brief moment. Something in Izuku snaps, all the panic and stress of the day finally catching up, and he doesn't hold back. He lashes out with his claws, carving deep gouges into the hand around his ankle. The thug yelps and leaps back, but his buddies immediately take his place and jump into action. Of the 2 remaining thugs, One seems to be able to propel himself faster through the air and one has blue scales all over his body. Izuku doesn't know if that is the extent of the latter's quirk, so he tries to keep an eye on him while evading attacks from both. He's slowing down though, and eventually the thugs are able to grab him yet again, this time restraining his arms and making sure they can't move to scratch anybody. Izuku can feel himself begin to hyperventilate. All he can think of is that this isn't how he wants to die. He wants to see his parents again. The world shifts. All of a sudden, everything seems so much bigger than before. The thugs aren't holding down Izuku's arms anymore, and he looks down. He doesn't see arms, however, he sees feathers. Is this another part of my transformation quirk? He senses something incoming from the right and his bird instinct acts fast, taking off and flying smoothly to the open window and beyond. He can hear the thugs shouting behind him and calling for others to give chase, which they do. Izuku hadn't thought they would be able to keep up with a bird, but it seemed a few of their members had flying quirks or wings. Unexpectedly, a blue scale comes shooting past Birdzuku's head. He has to veer to the side to dodge it, and in doing so, flies directly into another attack. He shrieks in pain as the scales tear through his wings, but stays airborne long enough to dive into an accompanying alley. Before his pursuers catch up, Izuku does his best to hide himself in the rubbish, which would be easier if he didn't have glaringly obvious gold feathers. Two men walk into the alley, and one flies in from above, effectively surrounding the poor bird on the ground. End of the line, birdie. One of them cackles triumphantly. Izuku would call him a-hole. He reaches down to grab the injured Izuku, who shuts his eyes in resignation. Want to tell me what's going on here? A new voice asks. Although Izuku still doesn't open his eyes, he can feel the thugs in the alley freeze before shifting to fight. Cries of pain and surprise can be heard, so he assumes whoever the new person is, they are the cause. He knows that it's pointless, but he still tries to use the distraction to escape, but barely makes it a few hops before a boot blocks his path, and a hand grabs him with more force than necessary. Back off or the bird gets it? A-hole from earlier threatens. Izuku, who is now very dazed both from blood loss and the constant pushing around, vaguely sees a gray blob at the end of the alleyway and two other blobs on the ground. Why go through all this for a bird? Gray blob asks. Why would I tell you? A-hole sneers. Gray blob just sighs and, faster than Izuku can see, has A-hole on the ground and him safely a few feet away. All right, now that that's taken care of. Gray blob says, then pulls out his phone to call someone. Just as he is about to leave, Izuku chirps, which, in hindsight, probably wasn't the best idea for someone just free of a kidnapping to draw more attention from strangers. But if this stranger blob was willing to take down 3 thugs for a bird, maybe they were okay? Gray blob turned to him with a tired expression, then seemed to notice the blood still covering his wing. But crouched down and gently looked over the wounds that he could see. Izuku chirped again, trying to say, in his own bird way, thank you. Speaking of which, he really needed to figure out how to change back to his normal form and get back home. Thankfully, that turned out to not be as big a problem as he thought. The gray blob looked at Izuku with an unreadable expression on his face, and then activated what Izuku would later learn was his quirk. In the distance, you could hear sirens wailing as they approached their ally. As Gray Blob became more gray-red blob, and his hair started floating, Izuku could feel himself going back to normal. While Izuku was in part relieved, he also realized that the injuries from his wing had transferred to this form, and now he was bleeding a lot more. Gray Blob's eyes widened, not that Izuku saw that, because Izuku's vision was still not doing its job, but Gray Blob seemed to realize that this situation was probably much worse than it seemed, because chasing a bird was one thing, but this was a child, and he looked like he was about to pass out from blood loss. The sirens got closer, and the lights flashed over the alleyway. Izuku tried to mumble something about needing to get home, but it just came out as slurred gibberish. Don't worry, kid, I've got you, Blob says, although Izuku can't quite tell, because the lights are making sounds and colors are singing the alphabet. You can call me Eraserhead, and I'll make sure to keep you safe. Aizawa POV. When Aizawa used his quirk on the bird, he was not expecting something to actually come of it, especially something like an actual child. It did, however, make him all the more glad he'd been nearby and had gotten there in time. He wouldn't lie, it had confused him as to why a group of 3 men would be chasing a clearly injured bird with so much determination. While he didn't have the whole story yet, he could put enough together to make a narrative that was most likely true. After erasing the kid's quirk, he had seemed so dazed and out of it that Izawa was glad he'd called for an ambulance too. This kid would need it. Despite not even being halfway done with this night's patrol, Izawa decided to ride in the ambulance to the hospital with the kid, just to confirm or deny a few theories of how said kid even got into the situation in the first place. The ride to the hospital was just as boring as it always was, but it did give him time to study the child in front of him and try to figure out just what about him could have been so desirable that he would be getting chased across the city in the dead of night. Aside from a pair of wings on his back, nothing seemed to specially stand out to Izawa. He hoped that the kid wasn't getting abused at home. He'd heard about parents who hated their children because of a mutation quirk and ended up kicking them out or selling them off to sick people. He still remembered the 2 twins he saved a few years back with the lizard mutations. The looks in their eyes would haunt him forever. So yes, there were quite a few reasons for Shoyuta to be in this ambulance right now, especially if it meant getting a kid out of a potentially abusive situation. Thankfully, his worries seemed to be far from the truth, because once the child is loaded of the ambulance and into the hospital, he notices 2 very distressed parents in the waiting room and finds them to be the mother and father of the kid he just saved, whose name is Izuku. After talking to the Midoriyas for a while, he's thoroughly convinced that he was just being paranoid, and, after asking what Izuku's quirk is, it all but confirms it. With a quirk that could create and was made of precious stones like his, anybody who got their hands on it could be a very rich person. He expressed this to Inko and Hisashi to help them understand why someone would want to kidnap their son. The horrified looks on their faces solidified even further that these people were absolutely not the cause of Izuku's misfortune, and would likely take measures to prevent it from happening again. At least, that was his hope. Aizawa's phone chimes, and he sighs, because he knows it's time to leave and get back to Hiroenji. He hopes the kid will be okay. For days later. Izuku POV. It's been a few days since he escaped the warehouse, and he was only released from the hospital yesterday. Despite his constant reassurances that he was fine, and that walking to school wouldn't be an issue, Inko had been fussing over Izuku nonstop the past few days, always being in the same room as him and insisting on bringing Izuku to school via car, instead of letting him walk like always. While Izuku understood why she was being so protective, he'd been kidnapped, he would admit it was getting real old real fast. Izuku walked up to his first class of the day, honestly not feeling like school today. He just wanted the day to be over with, even though that was kind of out of character for him. When he went inside, all conversations stopped and every eye turned to him. Whispers started immediately. He caught brief fragments as he walked to his seat. That him? Kidnapped. Had to go to the hospital. He wondered about how everyone already knew about his whole ordeal, but it didn't take long to realize Bakugo had probably been the one to tell everyone. While he and Bakugo weren't exactly friends anymore, their mothers still were, so when Izuku was in the hospital, Mitsuki had come to comfort Inko and assure her everything would be alright. Then Mitsuki probably told her husband and son what had happened the moment she got all the details, like the little gossip she was. Not that Izuku was complaining about that, he loved gossiping with his mother about all kinds of school drama. You pick up a lot when no one notices you're even there. Inwardly, he sighs because he knows it's going to be a long day with many stares and awkward questions with even more awkward answers. The teacher begins speaking and he zones out. Lunch comes around quickly enough, and Izuku just wants to grab his food and go to the secluded rooftop like he usually does. However, he is quickly surrounded by people he doesn't know asking a million questions at once. Eventually, Izuku gets fed up with everybody asking the same general questions that he just didn't want to answer, and just explains the reason for the kidnapping and how he was saved. End of story. The people around him go silent for a moment, seemingly stunned for a second, before dispersing and fastly whispering among themselves. Some of the students, to Izuku's dismay, stay with him and ask to sit with him during lunch. He reluctantly accepts, but he is wary of why he's so popular all of a sudden. Nobody paid attention to him previous to his incident, so this is very out of the ordinary. As lunch goes by, he doesn't miss the way some of the students are now looking at his wings and claws. Looking back, maybe he shouldn't have told them why he got kidnapped. Getting up from the table, a few feathers come fluttering to the floor. It was a completely normal thing for him, it's just like losing hair and isn't painful. He reaches down to pick them up, and when he gets back up again, he sees one of the older boys in his class looking at the feathers with an intense look on his face. Izuku meets the boy's eyes and then said boy asks about his feathers. Are your feathers gems as well? You mentioned that parts of you were made from precious stones. He then gestures to the gold feather in Izuku's hands. Yes, but only the gold ones. Izuku answers, feeling slightly uncomfortable. Yeah, human interaction was not his strong suit. Was all the boy said in reply. As Izuku walked away, he could feel the boy's eyes on him the entire way, only stopping when he rounded a corner. The rest of school passed without a hitch, and despite being glad things had calmed down, Izuku couldn't help feeling like it was the calm before the storm. Sure enough, he was walking out of his last class when the boy from earlier cornered him in the hall. He had two others standing nearby, one of which had spikes on his face, and the other had a very long tongue that hung out of his mouth by a few inches. Their gazes were laser-focused on Izuku's wings. So, the boy began. I couldn't help but notice the gold feathers that fell out earlier. If you aren't going to do anything with them, you should give them to me. Izuku was stunned for a second. The nerve of this kid. And why would I do that? He asked. Well, it's clear you have plenty more, so what's one or two mean to you? No, Izuku moved to go past him, but he quickly moved to block his way again. Listen, I tried to ask nicely, so this is on you. He stepped closer to Izuku, crowding him into the wall. He locks eyes with Izuku and Izuku finds that he can't move. This must be his quirk. The boy gestures to his friends down the hall, and they come over, dumping out Izuku's backpack and grabbing the feathers that he'd carefully placed in a pocket. Noting that there were only 2 gold feathers, Long Tongue asks how they could all have a feather when there were only 2. All 3 pairs of eyes turn toward the still frozen Izuku. A ball of dread grows in Izuku's stomach as he realizes what's about to happen. The 3 boys walk toward Izuku, and all he could do was panic and try to think of any way out of this situation. The only thing he could think of was if the boy whose quirk he was under blinked, breaking eye contact with him and probably releasing his quirk. Izuku would then have to immediately close his eyes or look away to prevent it from happening again. Spiky Face and Long Tongue stalked over to him, and Spiky reached towards Izuku's wings. He latches onto a golden feather and pulls, and excruciating pain erupts all over Izuku's wings, pain that seems to infect every part of his body. He wanted to scream, but all he could do was stand there, frozen. Out of the corner of his eyes, he can see the boy whose quirk he was under start to close his eyes. This was his one and only chance. The second Izuku can move again, he shuts his eyes as tightly as he can and lashes out at the 2 boys still pulling at his feather, scratching both of them on their arms. They shriek and Spiky lets go, so Izuku pushes them away with more force than necessary with his wings. They go flying into the wall and don't move. What the hell, man? Eye contact boy starts shouting at him to stop. Izuku doesn't bother answering him and turns and runs down the hall. He knows words are being shouted at him as he continues to the school's exit, but he can hear anything over the pain still coursing through his wing. As he leaves the school, he makes sure that no one's following him before he just starts flying. All he can think of is, get away, so he flies and keeps flying for what feels like forever. When Izuku finally stops and lands, he starts to panic. He doesn't recognize where he is, it's dark, and he just attacked a schoolmate. The last time he was alone in the dark, he got kidnapped. His breathing quickens and he looks around for something, anything familiar. He couldn't help but think about what his parents would think if the last thing he did before dying was attack a classmate. It was getting increasingly hard to breathe, and he slid down a nearby wall and put his head in his hands. He had to calm down. He couldn't calm down. All he could hear was his own gasping breaths. He had to get home. Tears started rolling down his face, because he just felt so helpless and he couldn't move because he couldn't breathe, and it felt like earlier when he'd been under the effects of the quirk. He hears a slight scuffling sound down the alley and his heart nearly stops. This was it, he was getting kidnapped again. Kid! Izuku POV. Kid. The stranger spoke again. The voice sounded familiar, but Izuku couldn't quite place where from. A moment later a hand was placed on his shoulder, and Izuku froze up, thinking about how this was it, he was never going to be seen again. Dramatic much? He thought to himself, even though he was kind of justified. A lot had happened to him. Kid, can you hear me? Izuku's eyes snapped open and in an instant he was on his feet and hurriedly backing away from the stranger. Through his slightly blurred vision from tears, he saw a gray blob. Gray blob? This was the same person who saved him a few nights ago. Izuku's parents had mentioned that a hero had found him and brought him to the hospital, but that he had not identified himself. Before he could back up any farther, a gray cloth moved from around Blob's neck to gently wrap around Izuku's waist. Hey, it's okay, I'm a pro hero, you're safe with me. I just want to know what you're doing out this late and maybe walk you back home. You can call me Eraserhead. Blob Eraserhead says to him. Your name is Midoriya, right? A pro hero knew his name? Despite the fact that he just had a panic attack and was in the middle of nowhere, Izuku's fanboy self couldn't just let that slide. Yes, he spluttered out. Eraserhead raised an eyebrow but decided not to comment. All right, Midoriya, want to tell me what you are doing out here so late at night? Aizawa POV. That night, Aizawa had decided to stray a little outside of his usual patrol area, just to give himself a little more unpredictability. He was just beginning to patrol when he saw a flash of black and gold shoot past a couple roofs over. While it hadn't seemed like much of a threat, if it was a quirk, it was still illegal quirk usage without a license, so he followed as close as he could. Now imagine his surprise when the flying thing slowed down and landed, and it turned out to be the boy he'd saved a few days ago. Midoriya Izuku was his name. He'd stayed close but decided to wait a moment before revealing himself. As he watched, he couldn't hear it very well, but it seemed like the kid started having a panic attack the moment he'd landed. Quick, uneven breaths reached his ears, and he decided it was time to intervene. Shoyuta jumped into the alley as quietly as he could, trying not to startle the boy, but he intentionally made a few scuffles to make his presence known. That turned out to not be the best idea he'd ever had, because Midoriya's breath quickened even more. Kid, he asked. No response. Shoyuta started approaching the boy, and as he got closer he could see tiny jewels glistening in the streetlight, littering the ground underneath where the boy was crouched by the wall. Kid, he asked again, and when there was still no response, he placed a hand on Midoriya's shoulder. Kid, can you hear me? The boy's eyes flew open and he darted away from Aizawa, stumbling only once he was about 10 feet away. Aizawa quickly used his capture scarf to gently wrap around Midoriya, making him unable to retreat any farther. He had to be honest, he was impressed with how fast this kid was. It had surprised even him for a moment. However, this also made Shoyuta realize he had to de-escalate the situation and assure Midoriya he wasn't a threat, especially after all that he'd gone through just a few nights ago. Hey, it's okay, I'm a pro hero, you're safe with me. I just want to know what you're doing out this late and maybe walk you back home. You can call me Eraserhead. Aizawa saw the boy's eyes widen slightly at that, so he assumed he did something right. Your name is Midoriya, right? The boy's eyes widened even further at that, and he wondered if Midoriya remembered him or if he'd been too out of it when they met. Finally, Midoriya spoke. Yes. Aizawa wasn't quite sure why he'd gotten the reaction that he did, but he just chalked it up to the kid having a panic attack seconds ago. All right, Midoriya, want to tell me what you are doing out here so late at night? He questioned. It was an honest question, because either this kid was in trouble again, or he had the survival instincts of a fish. Why else would he be outside, alone, in the middle of the night again? Midoriya looked slightly uncomfortable, but answered anyway. I got into some trouble back at school. I didn't realize how far away I was and how late it was until now. That made slightly more sense? Aizawa decided he needed to know more about what this trouble was, and why it caused Midoriya to run away. He also needed to have a chat about illegal quirk usage, but he'd let it slide this time. Come on, I'll walk you home. He instead said. He could get his answers on the way. The boy started to object, But Aizawa pinned him with a no-nonsense look and continued walking, Midoriya now keeping pace beside him. He gestured for Midoriya to lead the way. After all, why would he know where the kid lived? They walked in silence for a few minutes before Aizawa decided to have Midoriya elaborate on his past statements. "What was the trouble you mentioned earlier?" he asked, straight to the point because he wasn't someone to beat around the bush and be all nice. Hisashi was always telling Shoyuta how he needed to be more compassionate, but that wasn't fair. He could be very compassionate when he wanted to, after all, he was here, walking a kid home when he didn't have to. Midoriya was silent for a moment before answering, "My classmates. They wanted my feathers, but when I told them no, they wouldn't listen." The more he talked, the more Midoriya's voice started to waver and his eyes seemed to be welling up with tears again. Aizawa was about to say something when Midoriya continued. "I just don't get it. Why does this have to happen to me? I don't want to be valuable or special, I just want to be me. Why can't people just leave me alone?" The boy was crying now, and Aizawa watched in fascination as the tears falling down his face turned to gems before his very eyes. Midoriya stopped, seemingly noticing the gems too, and scrubbing his face while he reached down to pick them up off the pavement where they'd fallen. It was then, watching a boy with tears streaming down his face, picking up the evidence of his breakdown, that Shoyuta made a decision. He placed a comforting hand on Midoriya's back, not saying anything, but silently knowing that he would not let this boy suffer anymore. They walked the rest of the way to Midoriya's home in silence, only stopping when they finally reached the door. Mrs. Midoriya opened the door and immediately hugged Midoriya, saying how worried she had been about him. After a few moments of assuring her he would be okay, she left him by the door, eyeing Aizawa but smiling her thanks. "Thank you for walking me home, Eraserhead sir," Midoriya said as a parting note. Before Midoriya could shut the door behind him, however, Aizawa asked if he could quickly speak to his parents about something. Midoriya looked skeptical, but obliged and brought his parents to the door, who then told him to come inside and take a seat on their couch while they conversed. Once everyone was situated, Aizawa said what he'd been thinking all night. "I would like to train your son." Izuku POV. Eraserhead wanted to what? Train him? Where did this come from? He was still embarrassed from his outburst earlier. He hadn't meant to dump everything he'd been thinking out loud like that. Was it pity? Izuku really hoped not. He didn't want people thinking he was weak. After all, he could defend himself, albeit not very well. However, that led to a thought that maybe this could be a good thing. If a pro hero was training him, he would definitely be able to defend himself. Izuku snapped out of his thoughts and looked at his parents' faces, silently hoping they wouldn't object to this. They looked skeptical of the offer, but asked Eraserhead to explain more of what this training would entail. Me training Midoriya would mean him learning self-defense and how to use his quirk better. I couldn't help but notice how when I found him the other night, it seemed he wasn't able to switch back to his current form. If that were to happen again, there might not be anyone around who could help. Learning how to defend himself would be helpful too. If young Midoriya can fight back, then future attempts to kidnap or hurt him could be foiled. Izuku was glad Eraserhead hadn't mentioned the earlier events of the day, even though he was sure he'd have to explain it to his parents later. Speaking of his parents, they were looking at each other with intense expressions. Finally, Inko let out a reluctant sigh and asked for a few minutes to speak privately with Hisashi. Eraserhead nodded, and the pair stepped outside the door for a moment, leaving Izuku in the uncomfortable silence left behind. Thankfully, the two didn't need to talk for long, because a few minutes later they came back in. "We both think this would be good for Izuku," Hisashi stated. Izuku inwardly leaped with joy, because it was happening. "There are some conditions we would like to go by, however," Hisashi continued, and Izuku's heart sank a little, because he was unsure if this would be good or not. Eraserhead motioned for him to continue. "The first condition is that whenever you are training him, it can't interfere with his school. We also want to know where you will be training him, and that if you decide to move locations, you give us at least an hour's heads up." Eraserhead had dealt with plenty of protective parents before, and he understood where they were coming from. "I can agree to those terms," Eraserhead replied. They then spent the next few minutes determining when, exactly Izuku would be training and where. His parents had asked to observe the first few lessons just to get an idea of what Eraser would be teaching, and he agreed without a hitch. Soon after everything was sorted out, Eraser had left, but not before telling Izuku he would be seeing him that weekend. It took a while for Izuku to fall asleep that night, and with everything that had happened that day, he had a lot to think about. The rest of the week passed by in a blur. Izuku could barely focus because of how excited he was for the coming weekend. One thing did change for the worse, although it didn't bother Izuku as much as it could have. When he got to school the day after Eraserhead walked him home, he didn't miss the glares and disgusted looks sent his way as he walked down the halls. He walks into his class and notices that there's more of a bubble around him than normal. He knows that this probably has something to do with what happened yesterday, but he doesn't quite know the extent of it yet. He's prepared to just do his usual routine and ignore everyone else for the rest of the day, but to his dismay Bakugo stomps up to his desk before the PRD starts. "What the hell did you do, shitty Deku?" he shouts. Izuku inwardly rolls his eyes at the nickname given to him when they were toddlers. He also is grossed out at the spit flying from Bakugo's mouth as he yells, "I didn't do anything but defend myself, Kakin." Izuku replies in a bored tone, just wanting this conversation to be over already. "Right." Bakugo snorts. "That's why 2 of our classmates have concussions and had to get stitches for the scratches you gave them." Izuku's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't known how bad he'd injured them. Then again, he hadn't stayed long enough to find out. "I was defending myself," he repeated, but much quieter this time. "Sure." Bakugo fixes Izuku with a disbelieving stare, but Izuku doesn't care. He doesn't need Bakugo to believe him, he just wants him to go away. Thankfully, the teacher walks in and Kakin needs to go find his seat, so Izuku is spared from any more interrogations. Izuku isn't surprised when he hears his name over the loudspeaker at lunch, asking him to go to the principal's office. He mentally prepares himself to explain the whole ordeal again. Thankfully, there were cameras in the hallway where the incident happened, so Izuku wasn't punished in any way, but he was given a warning to not invoke any future fights, because those would go on his record. Despite being proven innocent, the students were not made aware of it, so they still had their own opinions and ideas of what happened. Izuku didn't really care, however, because he was never popular to begin with, so a little more hostility towards him wasn't too bad. As long as they left him alone physically, he didn't care. The only thing that did affect him a little bit was overhearing their conversations about him. Even though he knew it wasn't true, he was still hurt by the names they were calling him. By the end of the week, however, Izuku got used to it, and the constant sting of words slowed. Today was Izuku's first day of training with Eraserhead. He wouldn't deny how excited he was, both that he would be learning to defend himself, and that he was being trained by a pro hero, the best of the best. Izuku arrived at the specified destination Eraser had given, which seemed to be a local gym, and walked in with his parents trailing behind. He found Eraserhead already there, leaning against the wall while looking over a sheet of paper. He cleared his throat to announce his presence, and Eraser looked up at him and gestured for him to come closer, which he obliged. The majority of his first lesson turned out to be mainly focused on Izuku explaining to Eraserhead all the details of his quirk, and what he both knew and didn't know about it. Eraserhead listens to everything with rapt attention, occasionally writing in a small notebook of his. By the end of their lesson, Eraser has given Izuku a few ideas on what he could try and work on in between their lessons, but also told him not to do anything that might be potentially dangerous. While their time spent together had definitely been productive, Izuku wouldn't deny feeling a little let down that he hadn't learned any cool moves yet. Izuku and his parents bid farewell to him, but Eraser calls out one last time. "Oh, and Midoriya? Next time I'll be teaching you how to put someone in a chokehold." 2 years later. It's been a couple years since Izuku first met Aizawa on that terrible night, but his life has only gotten better since then. He still trains with Aizawa at least once a week, and his life is going great. Since starting training, he's learned so much, and, although he still can't beat Aizawa in sparring, has learned many offensive and defensive ways to fight, as well as many more ways to use his quirk. His quirk was apparently way more complex than Izuku had originally thought, but luckily together they'd been able to find out all aspects, including what his other forms were. It had been a tedious process, but well worth it in the end. He was on his way to becoming a great hero. It was actually pretty funny the first time Izuku ended up shifting in front of Aizawa. It even ended up being the first time he'd heard the man laugh out loud. Izuku and Aizawa had planned to meet up at a new location for training, and Izuku got there a bit early, just deciding to head straight there from school, foregoing home until later. He'd been absorbed in his thoughts, not paying attention to anything around him when all of a sudden a hand clamped onto his shoulder. He'd been so surprised that he'd shifted into a cat right in front of Aizawa. While completely unintentional, this was a monumental moment for him, because he'd only shifted twice before, once into an osprey, and once in this current cat form. Apparently, he'd looked so disheveled and had been staring at Aizawa with such a confused expression that Aizawa laughed for about 5 minutes straight. Then, back to Aizawa's normal self, he had Izuku work on memorizing the feeling of shifting and had him try on his own to get back to normal. It took a few tries, but in the end Izuku was successful. That wasn't even the best part though. Turns out, as well as turning into a cat and osprey, he could turn into a jaguar. Aizawa had said it was entirely possible that he had other forms, but Izuku honestly would have been happy with what he had. All his forms seemed to have the same colorings as his wings, with variations of mostly black with bits of gold, although none except for the osprey had real gold. However, some other things carried over from his human form, like jeweled claws and extra sharp teeth and beak. Speaking of Izuku's claws, he and Aizawa had made sure to practice with them, so as well as being able to use them to fight, he could easily change their shape, size, and composition at will. This made it incredibly useful, as he could basically have a concealed weapons on him at all times by making his claws just look like regular fingernails. Over the years, Aizawa also made sure to enlighten Izuku on quirk laws and their loopholes, to ensure he wouldn't get arrested for unlicensed quirk usage. While it did make Izuku quite sad that he couldn't just shift whenever he wanted, Aizawa explained that there were specific licenses aside from a hero license that could permit certain quirk usage. So that became the goal before becoming a hero. Getting a license to at the very least be able to fly in public. He'd made progress on that goal, and was probably only a year or two away from achieving it. In his opinion, it shouldn't be this difficult to use a quirk that was literally part of his body, but it's not like he could do much about it for now. Izuku had also learned much more about Eraserhead, whom he now called Aizawa. Aizawa had said he could call him by Shoyuda, but Izuku found it weird and just decided to stick to Aizawa or Mr. Aizawa. Apparently, he was married to the one and only present Mike. This came as a major surprise to Izuku the first time he'd come over to their house, because never in a million years would he have expected someone with Aizawa's personality to match with that of Mike. He could see it now though, how the two fit together so perfectly, both complementing each other and filling in each other's flaws. Although he would never say something as cheesy as this out loud, he wished he could find love like that someday. In between training sessions, Izuku found himself going to the Izayamadas more and more often, not that they were complaining, especially Mike, who loved it when Izuku came over. Home life had been complicated. Izuku's parents had been fighting a lot more recently, and while they hadn't directly talked to Izuku about it, he knew it stemmed from money problems. This uneasiness at home was the main reason he found himself going to the Izayamadas, and although he knew he was welcome there, he didn't want to overstay. Therefore, the past week he'd been distancing himself a bit from the two, but if Aizawa noticed, he didn't say anything, much to Izuku's relief. He didn't want to add anything to the man's plate. He was already doing so much with being a hero and training Izuku at the same time. So Izuku kept his worries to himself, hoping that if he ignored the cracks, they would heal themselves. Inko POV. Inko stepped into her home after a long shift at the hospital, kicking off her shoes on the way in. All day she dealt with difficult patients and emergencies that allowed no time to relax. It was exhausting. And after all that she did, after all her hard work, it still wasn't enough. 2 months ago, she had found the hidden bank statement saying that their family owed just over $20,000, about 3 million yen or 17,000 euros. She was completely caught off guard, and when she asked Hisashi about where this debt had come from, he admitted he had had a few unsuccessful trips to the casino. Inko was livid. The only reason she was still with Hisashi and not serving him divorce papers was that he had profusely apologized and promised it wouldn't happen again. Therefore, against her better judgment, she'd given him one more chance. That didn't stop the fact that they still had to pay back all the money they owed, however. Both she and Hisashi had been picking up extra shifts, but as Inko was the main income for the household, she'd been taking even more than usual to hopefully get the money they needed faster. Something gold gleamed from the corner of the living room, snapping Inko out of her thoughts. She walked over to investigate what it was, and wasn't surprised when she saw it was one of her son's feathers. She'd asked Izuku many times to make sure he didn't leave feathers around the house, but the occasional one escaped his gaze, and he didn't end up picking it up. Looking at the golden feather, Inko moved to throw it away, but then a thought struck her. This was real gold, wasn't it? And real gold had real value. Izuku hadn't gotten kidnapped at 9 for no reason, after all. His quirk was essentially an infinite money source. Inko quickly scolded herself. She could never use Izuku like that. But one little feather couldn't hurt, right? Plus, it wasn't like she was doing it for no reason. They really did need the money. Taking one last look at the feather, she made up her mind and got back in the car. The drive to the local jewelry shop was possibly the longest drive of Midoriya Inko's life. The whole while, she was running through thoughts of whether or not this was justified, using her son's quirk as a means to make money. It's just this once, she kept telling herself, over and over until finally the thoughts subsided and she was left in silence, with only the sounds of her breathing and the road around her keeping her company. The bell jingled as she walked in, announcing her presence to the shopkeeper, who looked up from behind his desk. "Hello, how may I help you today?" he asked in a cheery voice. His name tag read, Cameron, so Inko assumed that was how she could address him. "Yes, hi, I'm here to possibly sell something of mine." Inko replied, still unsure of her decision in coming here. Then, realizing she probably needed to give Cameron a little bit more context, she pulled out the feather and placed it delicately on the counter between them. "It's made entirely out of gold and I don't know how much it's worth, but I was hoping a professional could tell me," she explained further. The shopkeeper gave a sound of acknowledgement and pulled out a few tools before carefully examining the feather. After a few minutes of silence except for the small clinking of tools, Cameron looked up and asked Inko where she had gotten this. Panicking, she simply said she'd found it on the road, but didn't know where it had come from. This definitely wasn't because she didn't want others to think she was a bad parent. No, absolutely not. It was for Izuku's safety. The less people who knew he could make precious metals and gems, the better. Yes, that was it. She needed to keep Izuku as safe as possible. "Well," Cameron said, breaking Inko from her thoughts, "this seems to be real gold, and I was a bit skeptical at first because of how intricate the feather was. It's truly a work of amazing craftsmanship. Whoever made it had an incredible attention to detail." Inko felt a bit of pride at that, knowing it was her Izuku who made such a beautiful thing. Typically, this amount of gold can sell anywhere from $400 to $500. Inko's eyes widened in surprise. She would have never imagined it could be worth that much. "However," Cameron continued, "the detail greatly adds to the worth. For most people, I would assume they would just melt the feather down and make something else of it, but I can see the value in making other jewelry out of the already outstanding craftsmanship. All in all, I would be willing to pay you on the upside of $900 for this piece." Inko felt it was hard to breathe for a second. $900 for one feather. This was like a dream come true. Maybe she could drop a few shifts and finally relax for a minute. No, that wasn't why she was doing this. She had come here with a goal, and the money from this feather would be contributed to paying off their debt. "Ma'am?" the shopkeeper questioned. Inko, once again, was jolted from her thoughts. Wow, she really had to stop zoning out like that. "Yes, wow, I would be very willing to sell it for $900. She finally stuttered out. "Great. Give me a few moments to find the documents you'd need to sign, and once the money transaction is finished you can be on your way," Cameron replied in a cheery voice. He seemed like a nice older man, and as Inko watched him bustle around his shop, humming a tune under her breath, She couldn't help but wonder if she might one day have the peacefulness that this man seemed to surround himself with. Once documents were signed and $900 more were in Inko's bank account, she left for the door, calling out a farewell as she went. "Goodbye to you too," Cameron called back. "If you happen to find any more of those feathers, don't hesitate to come back. They are truly works of art and I'd be more than willing to buy more. Have a great rest of your day." Inko got in her car for the last time that day, and the guilt that she'd been previously feeling seemed to dissipate. This hadn't hurt anyone. In fact, it helped their family with some money issues. What was the harm in continuing to sell Izuku's feathers, especially if he had no further use for them? That night during dinner, Inko gave Izuku a new rule. Whenever he lost a feather, instead of throwing it away, he was to put it into a box by Inko's bed, safe from anyone going through their trash and stealing it. Something was up with Izuku and Shoyuta knew it. He'd invited the kid over for some extra training today, but he'd been more quiet than usual, his usual joking around nowhere to be seen. In fact, something had seemed to be off for the past couple of weeks. While mostly unnoticeable at first, Izuku stopped coming over as regularly as he did, and he became more guarded when talking about school and home life. Shoyuta didn't push, but he was becoming somewhat suspicious and had to refrain from outright asking Izuku to come over and just talk. He didn't want to assume anything was happening with the Midoriyas, but he figured he'd be invited, or invite himself if need be, to their house and see if anything was noticeably amiss about their dynamic. Back in the present, Shoyuta watched as Izuku rapidly shifted from one form to another. Cat, osprey, jaguar, human, and repeat. It had been something they'd been working on recently, hopefully refining Izuku's skills for any surprise encounters that would require quick thinking and shifting into a more suitable form. It had been slow going at first, just getting Izuku to be comfortable with what he could turn into, before they had moved on to more useful things like what he could actually do in them. Turns out, the instincts that he naturally had while shifted were akin to the animal itself, so not much fine-tuning was needed in that category. Fighting and defense had come next, and while Shoyuta would never admit it aloud, he was honestly a little scared of Izuku's jaguar form. In sparring he'd been bested by it several times, and while he loved cats, he couldn't deny feeling intimidated by the large feline. He wondered how his cats at home would react to the jaguar, or how they would react to Cat Izuku in general. Maybe they should test that later. It seems the kid would have to come over tonight after all. Izuku came jogging over then, sweaty but smiling, and grabbed his red water bottle from where it was placed on the ground near Shuta's feet. "How'd I do?" he asked excitedly. Shoyuta gave him a rare smile. "You did good, kid," he said, Izuku beaming at the praise. "Now what do you say we go to the apartment for dinner tonight? There's something that I want to test out, and I think Hisashi also wants to see how you've been doing." Izuku seemed unsure at first, but seemed to make up his mind. "Sure. Just give me a sec to let my parents know." Once the two were all packed up and Izuku had changed into clean clothes, they headed out. It was dark outside, and the streets were quiet aside from the distant noise of traffic. While they walked along the sidewalk, they talked about all the benign happenings of their lives. It wasn't long before they stood before a tall apartment building, and Shoyuta used a keycard to access the inside. They climbed up the short stairwell and Aizawa unlocked the door to his and Hisashi's apartment. Immediately after entry, two cats came flying at the pair, skidding around the corner and barreling into their legs at top speed. Shoyuta, used to this kind of thing, was able to keep his balance, but Izuku, who hadn't had as much experience, nearly toppled over, narrowly missing falling by flapping his wings to regain his balance. "You okay, kid?" Hisashi laughed from the end of the hall. "Yeah. I always forget about that." Izuku mumbled in response, pouting at his near fall. The two cats, Cat and Pickle, looked innocently at all of them before trotting back down the hallway and doing their own things. Shoyuta gave a weak chuckle but followed them down the hall and into the kitchen, where Hisashi had started making dinner for the three of them. "How'd it go today?" Hisashi asked with a smile that always warmed Shuta's heart. "Good." Shoyuta walked closer and gave Hisashi a quick peck on the cheek before jumping in to help with dinner prep. From the kitchen he could hear Izuku talking to the cats, something he did often and that both Hisashi and Shoyuta found very endearing. It was nice to know that even after everything his quirk had put him through, the kid was still able to be himself. If Shoyuta was honest, Izuku was almost like a son to him, and while he often scolded himself for thinking so, he couldn't help it. He'd been there for quite a bit of Izuku's life. It made him feel like a proud father whenever Izuku achieved something of mention. 20 minutes later dinner was ready, and the house was filled with the delicious smell of katsudon. On his way to the table, Izuku's eyes lit up. It was his favorite. That smile faltered when Kat came running in front of him on his way to his own food, nearly tripping and making Izuku fall again. "Hey!" Izuku glared at the orange tabby, who stopped and stared right back, before continuing to walk to his food bowl, all the while maintaining eye contact. Shoyuta smiled at their antics. It was a common but humorous occurrence in their apartment. Both the cats had very different personalities. Cat was the problematic one, always getting into trouble and causing chaos. He was infamous for his catitude, as Izuku called it, always giving people the stink eye or looking at them like they were the problem. Pickle was the more mellow one, but she tended to follow Cat's lead when it came to chaos, often getting herself into trouble as well. "Let's eat," Hisashi called, breaking the staring contest between Cat and Izuku. Once everyone was seated at the table, Izuku cheered and dug in, the adults giving small smiles at his eagerness. The three made small talk while they ate, discussing how each other's days had gone, making jokes. Altogether it created a very light atmosphere. Shoyuta thought back to the email he'd received a few days prior, from a certain rat who seemed to love getting into Shuta's business and making life difficult. It contained a job offer for him to be a teacher at UA. At first, he was ready to give an immediate no, but Hisashi had seen the email over his shoulder and practically squealed in excitement. Apparently he'd gotten one too, but had been waiting until he'd thought it over more to tell Shoyuta. And so, despite all of Shuta's doubts, he'd accepted, and Hisashi with him. The rat had responded fairly quickly, informing them that before they could teach a class of their own, there were mandatory classes they themselves needed to take. More work. Because Shoyuta wasn't already sleep-deprived as is. But seeing the look on Hisashi's face when he talked excitedly about teaching with Shoyuta was worth it. Gosh, he would do anything for that man. He looked at Hisashi across the table, the two locking eyes and silently communicating in the way that only two people who've known each other a very, very long time can. "Should we tell him?" Shoyuta. Yes, Hisashi. Shoyuta rolled his eyes at his husband, who was nearly vibrating with excitement. "Hey kid, there's something we want to tell you." Izuku looked up from where he'd been demolishing his katsudon. He questioned, wiping his mouth with the napkin by his plate. "We got a job offer from UA recently." Izuku froze, eyes meeting his. "We've chosen to accept and will be teachers as soon as we finish taking the required classes." Izuku was silent for a moment, eyes as big as saucers. Shoyuta held his breath, not knowing exactly what the kid's response to this would be. Finally, the dam breaks. "Really? That's so cool. What will you be teaching? Will you get to teach hero students? What classes do you need to take to be a teacher? How Kid." Shoyuta interrupted. He already regretted telling Izuku. This would no doubt result in questions for days. Beside him, Hisashi snicked, knowing exactly what was going through his mind right now, and mocking him. The audacity of this man. He fixed Hisashi with a glare before continuing, "One at a time." "Yeah," Hisashi joked, "we can't answer you if you pass out from the oxygen loss, little listener. Breathe." And so dinner continued, much to Shuta's dismay, with rapid-fire questions and answers from Izuku and Hisashi. He wanted to go to sleep already, but then he remembered something from earlier that he still wanted to try. Once all the dishes and leftovers were put away, he turned to Izuku. "Izuku." Said child looked up from where he'd been petting Pickle and froze. Hisashi and Izuku looked at each other, both very afraid, and rightfully so, of the dangerous glint in his eye. Pickle, wisely, seemingly noticed the tension and hopped off Izuku's lap and trotted away. "I thought of something earlier and I thought we might test it out." Izuku shivered, already regretting where this might be going. Hisashi came to his rescue, asking for him, what might that something entail? "Well," Shoyuta sat down on the couch. I was wondering how our cats might react to Izuku in cat form. Hisashi and Izuku glanced at each other again. Think of it as a little training exercise. Hisashi started, but was interrupted by Izuku, who simply said, "Okay." It caught both the adults off guard for a moment, because the kid had seemed so skeptical only a moment ago, but Izuku had a contemplative look on his face, so it was probably the kid's curiosity talking. Shoyuta let out a sheet-eating grin, much to the others' horror. Maybe this wasn't the best idea after all. "Alright, let me grab the cats and you can go ahead." He got up from the couch to go search for Cat and Pickle, who had wandered off to who knows where. Not too long later he had both cats in his arms, and plopped them down in front of Izuku. "Alright, here goes." Nervously, Izuku got up from the couch and readied himself, letting his quirk flow through him. Moments later, there was a fluffy black and gold cat where Izuku was standing. Hisashi cooed. He'd only seen Izuku's forms a few times before, when he'd come over to drop something off for Shoyuta at their weekly lessons. "Mr. Cat." Izuku looked at Shoyuta and Hisashi for a moment before focusing on the other cats in the room. Pickle, like the sweetheart she was, simply walked over and gave Izuku a curious sniff before losing interest and walking towards Shoyuta, jumping up onto his lap and continuing to groom herself. Izuku then turned to Cat, taking a few steps towards him, waiting to see what his reaction would be. But maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. Safe to say Cat did not appreciate the unannounced guest. He fluffed himself up as much as he could and started aggressively hop-stepping towards Izuku, ears back and hissing all the way. Izuku seemed to realize his mistake and retreated towards Hisashi, but miscalculated and bumped into the coffee table. Instead of doing the logical thing and shifting back, all his cat brain could think of was get away, and so that's what Izuku did. Izuku ran. Just in time, because Cat sprang at Izuku with claws out, and smacked into the spot he had been only moments before, letting out a yowl of frustration. The next few minutes, to Shuta's eternal delight, consisted of a heated pursuit between Cat and Izuku, the former of whom was steadily gaining. Izuku's paws slipped on the tile floor of the kitchen, causing him to go careening into the wooden cabinets and stop completely. Cat had caught up. He got ready to pounce, but before any real damage could be done to Izuku, Shoyuta stepped in. He scooped up Cat, who started swatting and hissing at him, clearly not done with the intruder he had been pursuing. "Alright you, that's enough." Cat hissed once more, but seemed to recognize the finality in Shuta's voice and didn't aggress further. Hisashi came over and picked up the still trembling Izuku, petting his fur in the hopes it would calm him down. This sort of thing was a drawback of sorts when it came to Izuku's quirk. If he was in an animal form for too long or panicked and didn't consciously try to stay in control, the animal's instincts would take over, temporarily making him quite unpredictable. While not as problematic in a secure setting, this could potentially be very dangerous if Izuku went into heroics, both for him and anyone attacking. The unpredictability could endanger any civilians or fellow heroes that his animal instincts might deem a threat, and there weren't solid ways to bring Izuku's consciousness back. The two ways that he and Shoyuta had tested and worked on were either erasing his quirk, which forcefully made him come back, or letting him calm down enough to turn off the alarm bells going off in his animal head, then shift back on his own. Neither was the best strategy, so they'd been trying to figure out new ways to solve this problem, preferably just preventing it at all. It was a work in progress. For the meantime, however, they were just doing the next best thing. Shoyuta walked with Cat in his arms over to his and Hisashi's bedroom, opening the door and tossing the tabby inside. Cat let out an indignant meow when he hit the floor, landing on his feet as cats do. Shoyuta would most definitely be waking up to cat butt in his face tonight. He sighed. What was his life? A problem child and even more problematic cats. He wasn't really complaining though. When he came back into the living room, he found Hisashi and Izuku both on the couch, quietly talking. It seems Izuku had calmed down enough to shift back on his own after all. That was a relief. Now Shoyuta didn't have to use his quirk, causing his dry eyes to flare up. The two on the couch hadn't yet noticed Shuta's presence yet, him coming from behind them on near-silent feet. As he approached, he vaguely overheard whispers of "never again," and his personal favorite, Next time we run far, far away. Whatcha talking about? He smirked, knowing exactly what they were talking about. His smirk only widened when both of them nearly jumped out of their skin, and he had to use his quirk on Hisashi from shattering the windows with his girlish scream. We were just, talking about. Hisashi's nervous smile faltered, looking at Izuku and silently saying, "Save me." "The weather," Izuku added in helpfully, much to Hisashi's relief. Shoyuta narrowed his eyes, but let it go, because he did have stuff to do and could jab at Hisashi later. He also kind of felt bad about how that encounter with the cats had gone. He was the one who'd suggested it after all. But only kinda, because that would remain a wonderful moment in his memories forever. "Michim. Well, I don't know how true that is, but I think I need to get you home, kid." Izuku's eyes widened as he seemed to realize the time too. "Shoot. Right, let me get my shoes on." He rushed towards the door, saying bye to the tuxedo cat that was Pickle on the way. Hisashi watched the boy as he left the room, then looked towards Shoyuta with a soft smile on his face. Shoyuta stepped forward and gave Hisashi a peck before leaving as well, joining Izuku by the door. "Ready, kid?" Shoyuta opened the door, but not before making sure none of the cats were nearby and could run out. "Yep." Izuku replied with a smile, stepping through the doorway then allowing Shoyuta through. "All right, let's get going." The walk home was pretty uneventful. Not much happened other than the occasional police sirens heard off in the distance. Once Izuku and Aizawa were only about a block from Izuku's home, he spoke up. "You can drop me off here. It's only a few more houses, so I can walk there alone," Izuku said with a reassuring smile. Very well." Aizawa sighed, but he knew this was the norm, and despite all his questions as to why the kid wouldn't just let him walk him to his door like a normal person, he let it go. It's not like he didn't know where Izuku lived, he'd been there plenty of times, but it seemed like the kid just enjoyed walking the last few bits on his own. "Have a good rest of your night, Izuku. I'll see you next week." "Thank you, Mr. Aizawa." "And yes, of course," Izuku replied cheerfully. Aizawa sighed. He'd told the kid many times to just drop the formalities and call him by Aizawa or Shoyuta, but Izuku just kept at it. That's one thing he had to admire about Izuku, is that he was stubborn. Shaking his head but smiling lightly, Shoyuta started to head back home. Izuku POV. Walking in. Through his front door, Izuku couldn't help but smile. Aizawa and Yamada getting job offers from UA? So cool. That meant that if he got into UA someday they would be his teachers. "Izuku, honey, is that you?" Izuku heard his mom call from the living room. "Yeah, it's me," he replied, silently hoping she would just let him go to his room. To his dismay, she called out to him again in a sickly sweet voice. "Could you come here, please?" A cold dread started in Izuku's stomach. He knew what it meant when his mom used that voice. Ever since a month ago, he had complete and undying faith that his parents could do no wrong, but little by little he was losing that faith. It started off innocently enough, with his mom asking to put any golden feathers that fell off in a box by her bedside. Izuku hadn't thought much of it at the time. It even made sense when she told him it could be dangerous if other people looked through their trash and found it. But little by little, things kept adding up. Soon his mom was asking him nearly every day if any more feathers had fallen, and Izuku was getting more and more uncomfortable when he had to say no. Inko's face would flicker with an emotion he couldn't decipher for a second before falling back into her regular smile. Hisashi would glance at Izuku from across the room when he entered, that same emotion flickering before going back to whatever he was doing. Slowly Izuku started to distance himself, trying to convince himself that this was all completely normal and that they were just being protective and taking measures to ensure his safety. He'd even started to avoid Aizawa and Yamada a bit too. Though he felt bad, he couldn't help it. With every normal human interaction, his animal senses were going haywire, telling him not to trust anything or anyone, even though he couldn't quite tell why yet. "Izuku? Did you hear me?" Inko called out again. "But let's get this over with," Izuku thought while walking towards the living room where Inko was seated on the couch. She seemed to have been reading previously, a book in her lap and reading glasses on the small stand to her left. She smiled up at Izuku, and Izuku could only hope once more that this wouldn't turn into another awkward and uncomfortable situation like before. Yes, Mom? Izuku sat when Inko gestured at the plush chair across from her. Well, I was just wondering. So this was what Izuku thought. Do you have any feathers that may have dropped recently? I noticed that none were put in the box as of late. I really hope you haven't been hiding them or throwing them out, Izuku. Inko's face turned stern at the last part, making Izuku curl back just a bit. No, I wouldn't, it's just that none have fallen out recently, so there were none to put in. I promise I wouldn't do that. Inko fixed her son with a hard stare, looking deep into his eyes as if looking for any sign of lying. She huffed out a breath when she found nothing. Mom. Izuku took a breath, hoping that what he was about to say wouldn't result in chaos. Why are my feathers so important to you all of a sudden? The question was asked as a genuine question, but Inko froze and stared at Izuku. Her face got more and more red by the second. Izuku could tell she was mad, but he didn't know why. Mom dash. No! His mother screamed. The couch creaked with how fast she stood up. Izuku couldn't help it, he flinched back into the chair. This was the first time he'd ever gotten yelled at by his mother, and it was scaring him. All I've ever done for you is give you a good home and food to eat, but you're still a selfish little child. Staring at Inko with hurt eyes, Izuku was about to try and defend himself, but his mother continued, seemingly pent-up rage spilling out of her mouth with every word. Do you know how hard I've been working to keep us afloat? I nearly worked myself to death. And now that I've found a way to get a stable income, you decide to get all selfish. I bet you have been keeping your feathers from your father and I. Spit was not flying from Inko's mouth, and she started advancing towards Izuku, who was sinking further and further into his chair, too scared to move. You know, she hissed, yanking Izuku up from his seat, I almost thought we could make this work. I take your fallen feathers and turn them into cash, and all is fine. But no, you just had to make things difficult. She threw Izuku on the ground, who yelped as his wings were bent at an odd angle beneath him. If you won't willingly do your part in this house, then I'll have to do it for you. She reaches towards Izuku's wings, now out from under him, and grabs a hold of the first gold feather she finds. No, Mom, please dash, Izuku chokes out, tears already streaming down his face. Because did he do something wrong? Why was this happening? Was it his fault? Inko pulled, eliciting an ear-splitting shriek out of Izuku, who tried to JRK away from Inko, only to wrench the feather even more. The feather finally came free, and Izuku collapsed on the carpet, sobbing into his arms as waves of pain washed over him. He was reminded of his earlier years when he was bullied, but even then no one was able to make it as far as to actually rip a feather out. Izuku was in what he now thought to be the worst pain of his life, and he heard his mother scoff from a few feet away. Dramatic. Get up, I don't want you bleeding all over my carpet. Izuku could only lay there and wonder how his mother, who only moments ago had been kind and smiling, had changed to this cold person in a matter of seconds. I said get up, she spat, kicking at Izuku and making him yelp as the foot connected with his still throbbing wing. If you get blood in my carpet, it's gonna be you who pays for the cleaner. It's your fault we even went into poverty in the first place, so the least you can do is clean up after yourself. Izuku made to stand up, but the two froze when the front door creaked open. Hisashi POV. Today had been sheet. Work had been sheet, the train had been sheet, and his useless coworkers, most of all, had been sheet. Most of them had just lazed around, making the work Hisashi had to do all the more stressful because if their team wasn't doing work, that meant wage reductions, which in turn meant less money made. Although that last part might not be as big of an issue anymore, it was still frustrating. Hisashi wasn't an idiot. He knew what Inko was doing when she set up that box on her nightstand. But he didn't question her when thousands of dollars started flooding into their shared bank account from seemingly nowhere. Money was money, and if they had to use their son's fallen feathers for it, that was that. Hisashi knew that, morally, this wasn't considered okay in most people's books. But if he was honest, if nobody knew, he didn't care. It was an easy way to gain cash, and plus, he didn't feel much guilt from using Izuku like that. Honestly, Izuku had been getting on his nerves as of late, always talking about being a hero and dumb sheet like that. He needed to wake up to the cruel world around him and realize that with a quirk like his, he'd be better off making money and not risking his life to help people who probably didn't deserve it. Hisashi regretted letting his son be trained by that useless underground hero so long ago. It turned out to be nothing but a nuisance, especially when it just strengthened how Izuku practically worshipped heroes. Sighing, Hisashi walked up the steps to his front porch and slowly opened the door, trying not to wake anyone potentially sleeping. The house was dead quiet, but the lights were all on. Strange, he thought. He stopped when he smelled the iron tang of blood in the air. Immediately he got into a fighting stance, readying his quirk in case someone was in the house. His throat heated up and smoke came out his nostrils slightly, but he was ready for any intruders. They're in the living room. He could practically feel the presence from the living room from where he was standing, and leapt around the corner readying to attack whoever was there. Whatever he'd expected to see, this was sure as hell not it. His son, silently crying on the ground, wings wrapped around himself, and his wife, standing with a cold look on her face, holding a golden feather in her hand. Someone want to explain to me what is going on here? He looked at Inko expectantly. Our son, she spat, was being selfish and hiding his feathers from us. When I asked him for more, he started being disrespectful and denying me them. Apparently he doesn't want to do his part and help us pay for living. She scoffed. So I took a feather, and he's been whining like he's 5 again and refusing to get up. This brat. Hisashi had naively thought before that, if Izuku knew, he'd play along and would understand why they did what they did. Their dynamic wouldn't change, but they'd all be a little richer after. Turns out he was wrong. He turned to the boy who still curled on the carpet, trembling and shaking. Pathetic, a voice in the back of his mind said. How could Izuku wish to be a hero, but be this much of a crybaby at the slightest inconvenience? Turning to Izuku, he said just that. At last, Izuku looked up at him with teary green eyes, a look of shock and betrayal on his face. He started to cry again, but much louder this time, sniffles and choked sobs heard throughout the house. Hisashi reached for the boy, hoping to shut him up before the neighbors heard and started to complain. It was late after all. Izuku flinched as he braced for impact, his jewel-tipped fingers shielding his face. The blow never came. Instead, Hisashi looked at Izuku with a new idea forming in his head. The claws gleamed in the light, and when Hisashi looked closer, he could see the small jewels littering the ground where Izuku had been crying. If Izuku couldn't provide feathers at a fast enough rate, maybe there were other ways to gain the lost money. Quit crying already, he ordered. Get off the floor and go to your room. I don't want to see you till morning. Izuku looked at him for a moment before scrambling up and running out of the room, the blood on one of his wings shining under the light. He could hear a door quietly shutting moments later. Now that the boy was out of the room, the true weight of what just happened hit Hisashi like a truck. What do I do now? If that brat tells anyone, I'm ruined. A plan began to formulate in his head, all the possible ways the situation could go wrong entirely plausible, but with this plan, maybe it wouldn't be so bad after all. It seems that tomorrow he'd have to call his buddy up on his way home from work, picking up some jeweler's tools among other less legal things. Izuku awoke to the steady stream of sunlight coming through his half-closed blinds. He sighed, bringing a hand to his face. Brushing his curls out of the way, he rubbed at his face in an attempt to push away the lingering tiredness. Must have forgotten to shut them last night. Groaning, he turned his head to the side and moved to get up, wondering if he'd slept through his alarm or if it just hadn't gone off yet. Looking at the little clock on his nightstand, the time read 6:41 a.m. I'm early then. Sitting up, he felt a little strange, like he knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite place it in his still sleepy state. Memories came flooding back when he got off the bed and his wings started throbbing, aching with every little jostle. He shivered, not quite knowing what to do. That was the first time he'd ever seen his parents that angry. He knew his mother had taken a feather from him, but he couldn't quite remember all the details. It was like he knew what happened but in all his panic couldn't quite say how. What? A quiet voice in the back of Izuku's mind spoke, altogether just making him feel worse about the current situation. Was it my fault? Was she right? Was I wrong? Then, it's too early for this. Yawning, he moved towards the bathroom, ignoring the dull pain in his wing. Why does it hurt so bad? It was just one feather. Pushing the bathroom door open, Izuku reached for his toothbrush, starting his usual routine of getting ready for the day. In his slightly groggy state, Izuku realized that he probably should take a shower. There was blood still caked in between his feathers where he hadn't bothered to clean up before falling asleep last night. From the bathroom, he heard his alarm finally go off, and before it could disturb anyone else in the house he rushed to turn it off. Once back in the bathroom, he turned on the shower and undressed quickly, stepping under the still cold water. It felt relaxing on his wings, slightly numbing them in the process. 30 minutes later, Izuku was dressed and ready for school. As he reached for his room's doorknob, he hesitated. What would happen when he walked into the kitchen for breakfast? Would Inko be there? Would Hisashi? Shaking away those thoughts, he opened the door. Not giving his brain a chance to falter and freak out, walked down the hallway towards the kitchen. Was the hallway always this long? That's stupid. How would a hallway grow overnight? His erratic thoughts were most definitely the case of nerves, so Izuku pushed them away too, focusing solely on what he needed to do. Get his breakfast, probably eggs, or make it if it wasn't already, put his dishes away, and walk out the front door to go to school. Simple, right? If only. The kitchen light was already on, and Izuku could hear the sounds of food being made from where he stood just outside of sight. He readied himself to go inside, but before he could take that step, a voice said, "Izuku?" It was his mother. Why did she sound so normal? "Izuku, is that you? Come in, I have breakfast ready." Stealing his nerves, he rounded the corner and faced his mother, who was setting a plate full of breakfast on the dining table. When she spotted him, she gave a warm smile, then went back to cleaning up after herself. Glancing from her to the food in front of him, Izuku sat in his seat, cautiously picking up his fork and beginning to eat. The silence was interrupted by the soft clinking of dishes as Inko washed them, her hands pausing every once in a while when she glanced towards him. This was definitely not helping his nerves. Was she going to say something? Or just act like last night never happened? Either way, Izuku was anxious about all possibilities and their results. About yesterday evening. Inko began. Izuku froze mid-bite, body tense. Maybe she would apologize? You can't tell anyone about that, you know this, right? Inko was still meticulously washing the dishes, avoiding Izuku's eyes. He was stunned for a few moments before opening his mouth. Then shutting it again. Then opening it only for nothing to come out. What happened was a mistake, and if you tell someone, they will no doubt take you away. You don't want that, do you, Izuku? She finally looked at him, eyes scanning over every inch before finally landing on his eyes. It felt to Izuku like she was looking straight through him. I know I wouldn't want that. And neither would your father. Inko looked at him expectantly, waiting for an answer that never came. His eyes were locked on the edge of the tablecloth, afraid to meet her gaze. Tears were building in the corners of his eyes, and he didn't want to let her see that. Izuku. Her stern voice reached him, and he flinched, surprising himself with the motion. He cleared his throat before responding. No, I don't. I wouldn't want that either. His shaky voice sounded uncertain even to him, and it made him cringe. I really don't. I don't know where I'd go, so please believe me. I don't want to leave. But I'm scared. Finally looking up at his mother, Inko could then see his watery eyes and trembling lips. She frowned, clearly displeased with what she saw. Honestly, she sighed, you're always so sensitive, Izuku. If you really want to be a hero so badly, you need to toughen up. Otherwise you won't make it anywhere. The unexpected jab only broke him further, so he turned away so she wouldn't see the tears that broke free now falling down his face. He quietly got up and excused himself from the table, placing his plate in the sink where he would wash it later. Being a hero was what he strived for. His training with Aizawa wasn't for nothing after all. He'd known what he wanted to be ever since before his quirk came in and made that dream even more possible. He had figurines of all his favorite heroes in his room, filling his shelves and making him smile every time he looked their way. His parents had been nothing but supportive of that dream until now, so what happened? Stupid question, he thought. Last night happened. Splashing water on his face from where he'd walked to the bathroom sink, he looked at his reflection. He saw the same him he always did, greenish-black hair, gold-flecked green eyes, pale skin, freckles. 2 large, elegant feathered wings protruding from his back, framing his body's reflection. This caused a small smile. As long as he had his wings and his quirk, he would be fine. He could take the comments and cold looks. As long as he had himself, he didn't need to rely on anyone else. Even if it hurts not to. Tearing his eyes away from the mirror, Izuku dried himself and stepped out of the bathroom. Not expecting anyone to be right there, he then slammed into somebody. "Shoot, sorry," he gasped. "Izuku." Izuku froze when he recognized it as his father's voice and not Inko's like he'd expected. Most days Hisashi had already left for work by now, but today apparently he was running late. He didn't meet Hisashi's eyes, but tried to move around him and towards the door where his backpack was sitting. He still had school today after all. Life doesn't just pause because of trauma, annoyingly enough. Izuku flinched when Hisashi grabbed his arm as he walked past, feeling his cold, harsh gaze. "I heard you had a conversation with your mother, correct?" he asked. "Don't know if you could call it a conversation, really." "Yeah, I did." Izuku gulped, hoping there wouldn't be a repeat of earlier words spoken. Hisashi looked at him one last time before turning away, seemingly done with him. "Good. I expect you to behave." The words held a sort of promise to them, a sharp edge lying underneath seemingly normal words. Izuku really did not want to find out what that could possibly mean, so he just nodded and faced the door yet again. Picking up his backpack and putting on his shoes, Izuku opened the door, relieved to finally leave his tension-filled house behind him. Thank God that's over. Taking a deep breath in, he continued walking down his street and towards Aldra Junior High, also known to Izuku as another form of hell. The wind was blowing today, causing Izuku to squint whenever a stray curl blew into his eyes. The sun was out too, with large puffy clouds painting a beautiful sky above him. "I wish I could fly." Such a strange thought, for him to wish to be able to fly when he knows he has wings. If he truly wanted to, Izuku knows he could take off right now and fly the rest of the way. Too bad he didn't have his flying license yet. All the more reason to work harder with Aizawa to get it. Smiling to himself, Izuku again recalled the last night, the moments he'd shared with Aizawa and Hisashi, before everything had gone to shit. He lived for little moments like those. All the chaos and lightheartedness around him was the most comforting part of his days. A stronger gust of wind almost knocked Izuku off balance, but he righted himself with his wings before anything happened, wincing in the process. While he did in fact wish he could fly to school, it probably would have ended up hurting more than he'd like to admit. Pausing on the sidewalk, a thought came to Izuku. If I can't fly, how about I walk? Nobody would notice another stray cat after all. Looking around, Izuku spotted a couple of dumpsters in an alley a few buildings away. The perfect spot to shift. Nobody will see me, and it won't be weird to see a cat come out of an alleyway. Grinning, Izuku practically ran over, earning confused looks from the civilians whom he nearly ran into on the way. So much for staying inconspicuous. To be fair though, he didn't really care. It's not like anyone would follow him just for running. Reaching the alleyway, Izuku quickly made sure absolutely no one could see him from where he'd crouched behind a dumpster. Closing his eyes, he cleared his mind of all thoughts, just like Aizawa had taught him. He felt the familiar pull of his quirk, and followed it before mentally yanking it into his physical form. When he opened his eyes, the world was much bigger than previously. Taking a step, he gave himself a second to get accustomed to his heightened senses. Izuku could smell and hear everything. There were people talking down the street while eating. Strawberry ice cream? His nose twitched in disgust. Ice cream in the morning? And why strawberry of all flavors? Anyways, he had better things to do, places to be. Turning his body around, he checked to see if anything had been left behind in his shift. He'd been working on that with Aizawa, testing his limits of what would stay on Izuku's person when he changed forms and what wouldn't. They'd concluded that anything directly attached to Izuku would stay with him, but if he had larger objects would stay behind. Hence why Izuku had a custom-made backpack that was small and lightweight, while still being able to carry all of his school books. Spotting none of his belongings on the ground, he faced towards the street he'd been on previously and continued trotting happily towards school, all worries temporarily forgotten in the bliss of using his quirk. Sitting in a well-lit office miles away, a certain rat found himself looking at a security camera feed. As he watched the boy-turned-cat trot down the alleyway and into the bustling street, he smiled to himself. Beady black eyes tracking every paw step, his smile only grew wider. It seems he may have found himself a shiny, glittery new toy. Then, sighing, it's truly too bad Aizawa got to him first. Guess I'll just have to watch from afar. For now. Settling into his seat, Izuku looked around the classroom he was currently in. While it was normal for him to be early and not many students around, it was uncommon for him to be completely alone in the room. There were usually at least a few tryhards, himself totally not included, who wandered in when he did, but today there were none. Occasionally Bakugo and his lackeys would show up early too, and Izuku had the feeling it was just to torment him some more. Not that they really could or would do much, but they found workarounds that still bothered Izuku in many ways. Ever since Aizawa told Izuku he should fight back, he did. His parents definitely had not been happy about the calls that had gone home, and he remembered the disappointed conversations about not using his training and quirk to hurt others. When he'd explained, however, that it had been in self-defense, their attitudes shifted. Instead of shutting him down, they agreed with Aizawa, telling Izuku that while he should never start a fight, finishing one was a different story. Hence why Izuku no longer had to worry about getting jumped in the school hallways between classes. Others quickly found out that he wouldn't just sit there and let himself get beat up anymore, so they were forced to leave him alone. Physically. It was every other week that a new rumor was spread about him, so the snickers and condescending looks from peers and teachers alike were never-ending. He was sure Bakugo was the primary reason for most of those rumors, no matter how many times he denied it. Izuku sighed, looking out the classroom window across from where he was seated. He could see upperclassmen milling around the campus, talking to friends and laughing. It left him with a sharp, sudden sense of loneliness that surprised him. He was just himself, Izuku, alone in an empty room, with nothing but his thoughts to keep him company. The loneliness was bearable most days. He'd been used to it since he'd gotten his quirk and gone into middle school. At least when his quirk had newly shown, people thought it was cool and would actually talk to him. Then with moving from primary school to a middle school with new people, first impressions mattered for most. Bakugo had made sure that anyone who had even approached Izuku in a friendly manner were told the truth about him and his quirk, and about how violent he was. If that wasn't enough to deter people, then the boy found other ways to prevent them from talking to Izuku. Other ways that usually consisted of bruised faces or burnt clothes. Sometimes both, Izuku was sure. But it had been like this for a while. Izuku was used to it, and had accepted it as how things would be. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt sometimes though. His mother's earlier words came back to him. You're always so sensitive, Izuku. If you really want to be a hero so badly you need to toughen up. Otherwise you won't make it anywhere. Had she really meant that? Was she right? Groaning softly, Izuku shoved the thoughts away, needing to focus on something, anything else. He looked at the clock, noting that there was still a little over half an hour until class started. Might as well walk around while I still got time. He opted to take his bag with him, knowing full well that if he left it there and someone else came in while he was gone, he most likely wouldn't see it again. The halls were relatively quiet in this part of the building, the majority of the sound coming from Izuku's footsteps echoing off the walls. Through a few doorways he could see classmates chattering with each other before the bell rang. It wasn't until he rounded the corner that he felt something off. The sickeningly familiar scent of Bakugo's explosions reached his nose, no doubt due to his heightened senses. If Bakugo was here already, why hadn't he gone straight to class like he always did? Unless he's found a new Play-Tui to torment. With that thought, Izuku's steps quickened, hoping that maybe he could do something to stop what was undoubtedly already happening. The closer he got, the more he could pick up harsh voices and thuds. Seriously, Kakin? Getting a bit cocky now, aren't you? Anyone could hear you. Not that they would do anything to their perfect student. Hell, He could probably blast someone's head off and they still wouldn't do a DMN thing. He followed the sounds to the bathroom at the end of the hall, but hesitated before opening the door. What if he made it worse? That's stupid. How could he make it worse? Aizawa always told him that if he was unsure about something, he probably just needed a better plan. There was always a better plan. Now, however, was not the time to make one, because just as Izuku was reaching for the handle, the door burst open. Jumping out of the way just in time, a blur of indigo sped past him, surprisingly fast. "Hey! Do you think you're going? Get back here!" Bakugo yelled out the bathroom doorway, fuming. He hadn't spotted Izuku yet, to his relief. Unsurprisingly, that didn't last long. Finally looking at Izuku still on the ground, Bakugo scoffed, eyeing him. "You never saw or heard anything. And if you did and decide to say something about it, I'll beat your butt." His voice was low and threatening, but it didn't sway Izuku. He'd heard this exact statement too many times to count. "Sure, Kaken," he said as he stood up and brushed himself off, tucking his wings close to his back. He couldn't help feeling a little guilty about hesitating earlier. If he'd rushed in, could he have helped that boy? The sound of the bell shook him away from his thoughts, reminding him that he did actually have class in a few minutes. Jogging back through the hallways, Izuku made it back to his classroom just in time for the final bell to ring. The teacher was already inside, no doubt hoping Izuku could be late just to have something else to chew him out for. Plopping back into his seat, Izuku closed his eyes briefly, mentally prepared himself for 7 hours of education. He almost didn't catch the multiple pairs of footsteps coming down the hall towards his classroom. Almost. It was normal for staff to be walking the halls during classes, but he'd memorized all their footsteps by heart. Not much else to do when you're bored after all. The teacher spoke up, "Class, today we have some new transfer students." That would make sense as to why he didn't recognize the footsteps, at least. From the doorway, the new students walked in. "It's the boy from earlier, it has to be." Izuku may not have been able to catch any of his features with how fast he was running, but he had noted the unusual color of his hair. It was a mix of somewhere between light purple and indigo. He seemed tense and on edge, not surprising from what happened previously. There was a girl too, with sandy blonde hair put up into messy buns. She seemed calm on the outside, but Izuku could tell just how much energy she was containing. She was practically vibrating from the strain of it. The two of them seemed comfortable with each other, not standing too far apart but not touching. Izuku wondered if they knew each other prior to this, or if they had just met today. Probably the former, just based on the circumstances. "Go on, introduce yourselves," the teacher prompted from the head of the room. He gave them an encouraging smile before going back to writing on the whiteboard. "My name is Hitoshi Shinso. Just call me Shinso." The indigo-haired boy, Shinso, spoke. He sounded exhausted, tone matching the eye bags he sported. The blonde girl spoke. "And I'm Himiko Toga. You can call me Himi or Himiko, though." She smiled wide, exposing sharp teeth much like Izuku's own. He decided he liked her and her energy. Maybe they could get to know each other if they didn't get warned of him beforehand. The pipe dream, probably. Looking down at his desk, he wondered what her quirk was. Actually, he wondered that for both of them. He fiddled with his fingers for a few more moments before facing back up, meeting Shinso's eyes with his own. His eyes were the same shade of indigo as his hair, Izuku noted. "Pretty. Could you tell the class a little bit about yourselves, possibly? Maybe about your quirk?" The teacher may have sounded friendly and inviting, but Izuku knew better. He hoped the two in front of him did too. The man just wanted to scope out whether or not he should pay them any mind. If they had powerful quirks, he and the rest of the school would SCK up to them. If they didn't, or had a quirk deemed unfit for their perfect vision, then they didn't care. The student would be left to the wolves, with nobody at their backs protecting them from what might come next. They would be on their own. Just like Izuku, but at least he could protect himself. Izuku once again held Shinso's eyes and silently tried to warn him as best he could. Thankfully, the boy seemed to understand well enough. "My quirk is a mental quirk. That's all I'm going to say." He glanced at Himiko, who was looking at her feet and nervously picking at her fingers. "And her quirk has to do with blood, kinda like the blood hero, Vlad King. Izuku sat up a little straighter. A mental quirk like Aizawa? As well as a blood quirk. Maybe if he got to know them a little better, they'd be willing to disclose more specifically what their quirks were. It was smart of Shinso to talk about Himiko's quirk like that. Blood quirks were typically ostracized due to being seen as villainous, but in comparing it to a pro hero, he kind of dulled that. If people thought that she might make a good hero someday, that's all it would take for her to be accepted, at least at this school. Izuku watched the teacher's expression closely, noting how his face tightened just a little bit before becoming neutral again at the evasive answer. Well, now that you've been acquainted, how about you two find your seats? I believe there are some in the back of the class. The teacher squinted, looking for empty desks. Ah, yes. He made eye contact with Izuku. There are 2 seats behind Midoriya. Midoriya, can you please raise your hand? Cheeks burning at the unwanted attention, he put his hand in the air, signaling to them where he was. The 2 squeezed around the other students' desks before settling into the 2 seats right next to each other behind Izuku. And that was that. Now that introductions were over, the teacher continued on with class like nothing had happened, occasionally sending glances their way. Probably looking for reasons to give them labels, whether good or bad. Izuku could feel the way Shinso's eyes kept traveling to the back of his head, staying there before going back to pay attention. He didn't quite know how to feel about it, maybe it was a bit strange, but he was probably just curious. Regardless, that curiosity likely wouldn't last long after he'd heard from other students how violent Izuku could get. The next few PRDS passed quickly, and to Izuku they just couldn't pass quickly enough. Having extra body parts such as wings, and using a quirk like his made him burn through energy like it was nothing. Therefore, eating was a very important part of his day. And lunch was finally here. Izuku had a place he always went for lunch, the rooftop for the gym. No one ever went up there, and there was a small area behind it where Izuku could use his wings to fly up without anyone seeing him. As far as he knew, not many people even knew about this roof, most opting to just use the dining halls or picnic tables outside. But it was quiet, and most importantly it was his. So imagine his surprise when he flew up after grabbing food from the cafeteria to find not 1, but 2 people on the roof. Looking closer, it was the 2 new transfer students. He hovered for a moment after seeing them, not knowing if he should just stay and eat there anyways or find a new spot. They hadn't seen him yet, so flying away was a viable option. Unfortunately, him staying unnoticed did not last for long. Shinso was the one who saw him first, frame tensing as if ready to flee. His eyes were wide and panicked, no doubt thinking back to what had happened earlier that day. Himiko saw Izuku too, but had much less of a reaction. Does he think I'd do something like that? I mean, I kind of thought based off of earlier he would have known I was okay. So sorry. We didn't know that anyone used this rooftop. We'll leave now. Tugging on Himiko's arm, Shinso stood up and started to retreat to a stairwell. Hey, wait. I actually don't mind, so you can stay. Izuku hoped he didn't sound too desperate. This might be his only chance to actually get to know some people. No, really, we can go. We didn't mean to disturb you. It was Himiko who spoke this time, eyes laser focused on the ground while nervously fiddling. It's really okay, I was just surprised to see someone else up here. He paused. I didn't even know there was a way to get up here. Izuku shrugged. I always just fly. Their eyes drifted to his now tucked wings. Himiko opened her mouth, then closed it. Izuku could see the questions brimming up within Himiko, but also could see that she was debating whether or not it was worth it to ask. Relaxing slightly, Shinso said, Oh, thank you. Your name's Midoriya, right? Yes. He responded cheerfully. And you guys are Shinso and Himiko, right? They nodded their affirmations while walking back to where they'd been previously seated. Izuku decided to take a chance and fluttered over too, sitting a few feet away. Close, but not too close as to be weird. The first few minutes were spent sitting in silence, just eating food and occasionally glancing at each other. Finally, just before the staleness got too much, Himiko broke the quiet. Sue, what's your favorite food? The question was directed hesitantly at Izuku. He blinked for a moment, caught unaware by the random question. Katsudon. He replied simply. Oh, that's cool. There were a few moments of silence. Mine's blood. Or pomegranate. She watched Izuku closely, waiting for his reaction. Izuku took a moment to process that she'd just said her favorite food was blood. Then, the analysis part of his brain took over. Earlier, Shinso had said that she had a blood-related quirk. If Himiko liked eating, drinking, blood, then more likely than not that was how her quirk worked. Is it because of your quirk? The question slipped out before he could stop it or find a better way to ask it. Both Shinso and Himiko tensed, glancing at each other. Hitoshi answered for her. Yes. Then, is there a problem with that? He said it defensively, clearly expecting a negative reaction that would never come. No, not at all. I'm just really into, analyzing people's quirks, so, He trailed off, not really knowing what would be the right thing to say next. I think it's pretty cool, actually. I've never met anyone with a blood quirk before. I do know someone with a mental quirk, though. They're pretty cool. Himiko spoke next, smiling hesitantly now. If it's alright, could I maybe ask you questions? About your quirk, Midoriya? You don't have to answer, obviously, but we could do sort of a trade-off of what our quirks are and can do. What do you mean we? Shinso grumbled from the side. Himiko elbowed him and he grunted reluctantly, a faint whatever coming out. Grinning, Izuku accepted the offer with shining eyes. The rest of lunch flew by, rapid-fire questions coming from both Izuku and Himiko alike. Shinso occasionally shared a bit about himself or gave some input. It was nice, the feeling that talking to them gave Izuku. The two of them listened intently to what Izuku's quirk was, but he never sensed any malicious intent at all. In fact, he noticed that they grew more comfortable around him once knowing that his quirk wasn't as socially accepted here, despite how flashy it was. Himiko gave details on her shape-shifting abilities, while Shinso simply stated that he could mind control people, not giving away much more than that. In the short 20 minutes of conversation, Izuku shared more about himself than he'd ever shared with anyone his age before. He thought, maybe a little selfishly, that this feeling could last forever. Maybe he could make some real friends for the first time in a long, long while. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be alone anymore. Inko was sitting at the dining table when her son walked in, minding his own business. She was content to let him be after a long day at school, but something about his presence made her turn to look. He's humming. He never does that anymore. And he looks much happier than he did this morning, that's for sure. Did something good happen at school? A million possibilities of what a good day at school could mean flashed through her head. The girl? A perfect grade? Or did he tell someone about what happened? Did they promise to help him? Is that why he's so happy? Hot anger flashed through her, but she calmed herself. I don't actually know if that's what happened yet. Keep your head calm, Inko, before you accidentally cause another mess. Izuku was about to walk down the hall to his room when his mother called out to him from where she was sitting. Izuku, want to tell me about your day? That was a loaded question. Izuku could feel it. Out of all the things he knew about his mother, he definitely knew when she was asking one question to get another's answer. She used the same tone when he was younger, when she knew he was doing something he shouldn't. She would ask a question about what he was doing, and in the end he would out himself by saying too much. So what is she really asking? My day was good. Not much happened, so. He trailed off, not knowing if it was the smartest idea to tell her about his newfound friends. Could he call them that yet? It was more of a relationship than he'd had with anyone at school in forever, so he supposed it would be accurate. Inko smiled at him, but her eyes held no light. I notice you seem extra happy about something, and I want to know more. Her tone was encouraging, open, and yet still Izuku could tell she was waiting for something specific to be said. Well, there were 2 new transfer students today. Izuku looked at his feet. I think they might like me. The last part was said quietly, barely more than a whisper. Sorry, could you repeat that last bit? Couldn't quite hear you, getting old in years, you know? Inko huffed out a little laugh before looking at him expectantly. Voice stronger. I met some new people today. We talked and I think I might have some actual friends for once. There was a beat of silence before, "Oh, that's wonderful, Izu, I'm so happy for you." She got up from her chair and pulled him into a hug, Izuku stiffening slightly at the unexpected action. If he was getting a hug, maybe that meant that everything wasn't that bad after all. Maybe last night really was just one huge mistake, and they as a family could work past it. Izuku relaxed into the hug, his mother squeezing him even tighter. "You didn't say anything to these new friends, right?" Her breath was hot against Izuku's ear. He tensed yet again, pulling away this time. But way to ruin the moment. Bringing up a freshly acquired traumatic event. "Great. No," he said with more confidence than he felt at the moment. Honestly, was trust non-existent now? He understood why Inko might be a bit paranoid, but this was getting out of hand. Couldn't she just be happy for me? Smiling, Inko gave a half-hearted, "Good. I'm glad," before allowing Izuku to leave. Trying not to seem like he was rushing, he grabbed his school bag and went to his room, closing the door behind him. Once inside, he slid down the door, letting his head fall back with a gentle thunk. The cool wood was relaxing and familiar, calming whatever negative emotions he had swirling around inside. This was his go-to method for whenever he was nervous or anxious, or just feeling shitty in general. Sighing, he focused his thoughts on his day, recalling the information he'd learned in class and also his discussions with Shinso and Himiko. It really made him so happy to have people who didn't immediately judge him off of first glance or gossip from others, like he's sure they heard. He had so many things he wanted to talk about. Things he had never brought up to someone other than Aizawa or his parents, and some details about his quirk that he'd kept private even from them. Then the logical part of Izuku's brain kicked in. "Slow down. You've known these people one day. What? You can't go putting all your trust in someone you've known less than 24 hours. It made him kind of sad to make that statement to himself, because it really only showed how effed up his life was, that he constantly had to be cautious of people letting him down. He stayed like that for a few minutes, just decompressing and sorting out his thoughts, rationalizing some of them. When he finally stood up the door, his mind felt clear for the first time in days. Something was different this morning. Izuku was excited to go to school? Never have I ever. But unsurprisingly, he knew very well just why. For the first time in a while he had not one, but two new people who he'd talked to for more than 5 minutes and actually liked him. Either way, maybe school wouldn't SCK so hard now that he actually had people to socialize with. Another plus for him was that if they hung out around Izuku, then Bakugo wouldn't pick on them. Physically at least. Or not, you never knew with him. DMNU, contradictory thoughts. The morning was surprisingly peaceful, no tense conversations with either parent, and no interruptions on the way to school. Shifting into his cat form was his new favorite way to traverse to and from school. Getting to school, however, Izuku already felt off. More than usual, that is. As a cat, he'd picked up Himiko and Shinso's scent on the way in, and with dread building in his stomach, he followed it. Making sure to avoid students who would surely run over to him and pick him up, he stuck close to the walls, making himself as invisible as possible. With his heightened senses, he could pick up loud cheering from the courtyard down the hall, so he sprinted over to see what was going on. Fight! 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 There was a crowd of people in a circle, and right in the middle was Shinso and Bakugo. Taking a quick look around, Izuku noticed Himiko standing a few feet outside the circle, clearly distressed. She had a busted lip and bruised knuckles, leading Izuku to believe that she was the cause of this whole fight, but likely hadn't been the instigator. Creeping closer and keeping low to the ground, Izuku could hear some of the argument happening between Bakugo and Shinso. "Then why don't you tell us what your stupid quirk is, huh? Afraid of something? Or are you just too much of a dash?" Bakugo was cut off with a solid punch from Shinso. The growing crowd cheered, exited at the idea of drama. "Oh my god, where is a camera when you need one?" The look on his face right now. Bakugo was livid, face contorted with anger and humiliation. "The hell was that for, you stupid F-dash? I'll teach you a lesson." His quirk crackled from his hands, the familiar scent of smoke reaching Izuku's sensitive nose. "I thought I asked you a question, and you just decide not to answer?" Shinso still hadn't said anything, only aggravating Bakugo further. Bakugo closed the distance between the two of them, getting right up in Shinso's face, but before he could throw a punch, Shinso spoke. "What are you gonna do, hit me? Is he trying to go to the hospital today?" "Shinso, you brilliant human. It's your funeral though." An eye roll. "Yes, act a dash." Then Bakugo was frozen, unmoving. The crowd surrounding them quieted down, a hush falling over everyone in the courtyard. Only Izuku and Himiko knew what was happening, what Shinso's actual quirk was. He crept closer and closer, weaving in between people's legs before approaching Shinso. Shinso, being the apparent cat lover he is, noticed Izuku immediately and smirked, recognizing him in his cat form. Izuku jumped up and onto Shinso's shoulders, curling around his neck before meowing in his ear. "You should leave." Thankfully, Shinso seemed to get the message, because with one last taunting look at Bakugo he left the circle of people to find Himiko. The crowd parted as he passed, whispers already spreading like wildfire. Shinso paid them no mind, however. "So, how'd I do?" The question was directed at Izuku, but since he was still a cat all he could do was meow back with as much disdain as he could muster. "I'm taking whatever that was as a compliment. I was a total badass." Izuku just snorted. "Yeah, a badass who's about to be 6 feet under when Bakugo unfreezes." Himiko came running up to them. "Hito, are you okay? Why did you jump in like that? And is that Izuku?" Izuku meowed in confirmation, hopping down from Shinso's shoulder and transforming back to human upon reaching the ground. "Hey Himi," he said as a greeting. "Can someone explain what I just witnessed?" Shinso scoffed. "I beat his butt, that's what you witnessed." Himiko elbowed him, so he gave an actual answer. "I left for 5 minutes to use the bathroom, and when I came back, they'd cornered Himi. They were harassing her and asking her questions about her quirk she didn't want to answer. I told Bakugo to f off and he didn't like that. He threw the first punch, but Himi got in between us and he hit her instead." He took a deep breath, looking to Himiko to continue if she wanted. "Once he hit me, a few of his friends came up and grabbed me from behind. I taught myself a bit of self-defense when I was younger, so I started punching them to get away. Eventually they left me alone, and that's when Bakugo and Hitoshi really started to get heated." Himiko kicked at the ground, clearly frustrated with the situation. Looking up at Shinso, "I couldn't do anything. I just had to stand there while you almost got hurt. Hey, if anything it's my fault because I instigated him so much. Don't beat yourself up for something that was out of our control. In the end, the whole situation wasn't our fault at all. It was those senseless Jarkis who threw the first punch and were harassing you." Himiko sniffed but nodded, reaching out to hug Hitoshi, who accepted. Izuku was standing to the side, feeling kind of out of place. They clearly had a deep relationship with each other, so being in this moment but having nothing to do with it felt strange. The two seemed to notice this and turned to Izuku. "Is he always like that?" Shinso asked. "Who, Bakugo?" They nodded. "Yes. Always." Izuku sighed, long and dramatic. "Welcome to what I've had to deal with since preschool." "Yikes, dude." Shinso whispered. The tree they were under swayed slightly in the breeze, leaves fluttering down, and one leaf landed right on Izuku's head. He scrunched up his face. He knew that catching a leaf in midair was usually considered good luck, but did it landing on him count? After reaching up and grabbing the leaf, he took a good look at it. "Is that bird poop?" Shinso noticed a moment after he did, and it only took a second for realization to reach him and he busted out laughing. Himiko seemed confused for a second before Shinso, between his wheezing, pointed at the leaf still in Izuku's hand. She started laughing too. "Traitor." And so Izuku was just sitting there. Him and his bird sheet leaf. That had been on his head. This day could not get any worse, could it? Izuku, to all his credit, kept his face carefully neutral when he put the leaf on the ground, sheet side down. This only caused his friends to laugh even harder, however. To Izuku's immense relief, the warning bell rang, giving him a legitimate excuse to leave as quickly as he could. To his immense disappointment, Himiko and Shinso stumbled after him, still cackling. Making their way to their classroom, Izuku was still getting teased by his friends. Honestly, he whined petulantly, that's enough guys, we're almost there. Come on. He was complaining but didn't really mean it, because how could anyone with a sense of humor not see how funny that had been? Didn't mean he had to like that it had happened to him of all human beings. Okay. But I mean, statistically, you have to admit that was impressive. Silence. And that was it. Himiko was down, Shinso not so far behind her. Yeah, Shinso gasped, standing up yet again. You losing a fight to stationary plant matter was impressive. This time the jab was calculated, a solid poker face backing it up. So this is how he wants to play. Izuku's eyes narrowed, and Himiko looked between him and Shinso like it was a tennis match. The three of them had to keep walking, obviously, class was in a few minutes. Honestly, incredible interception skills on my part. You really got CC'd on a message from the sky. What can I say, not everyone gets personally acknowledged by the canopy. Then, Shinso delivered the final blow. That wasn't acknowledgement, that was layered disrespect from nature. You didn't just get pooped on, there were DLVY mechanisms involved. There's probably an old superstition about this. Izuku stopped walking. Shinso stopped walking. Eye contact was held for a solid 3 seconds. It all started with an eye twitch, but before either of them knew it, they broke into howling laughter, Himiko joining in from the sidelines. Wheezing now, the three hurried to class, knowing they had less than a minute or they'd be late. Worth it though. Playfully shoving each other through the doorway, they made to go to their seats. As a collective group, they winced. Bakugo was standing in their path, and the rest of the students were practically pressing themselves up against the walls with the malice coming off him. Even his lackeys were giving him space. He stomped up to Shinso, who straightened but didn't back down an inch. I don't know what the F it was you did to me, but best believe I will dash. Boys. Bakugo. Please get seated, we have a guest with us today. You can finish talking after class. Yes, the teacher, always here to save face. And us. From getting blown up. Hurrying to their seats, the trio faced the door, wondering who this surprise guest might be. The door opened, and the whole class leaned forward, waiting in anticipation. So it came as a bit of a surprise when a furry, almost 3-foot animal came through the door instead of a person. What was even more strange was that this white creature was wearing a full suit as well as walking on 2 legs, like a person. The class immediately broke into hushed whispers, people wondering if this was a prank and the school was playing a trick on them. Why else would there be a stoat-looking thing in the class? Izuku, Himiko, and Shinso, from where they were seated at the back of class, could not see any of what the other students were talking about. They craned their necks before giving up and turning to each other, listening to what others were saying and trying to piece together what the disturbance was. The small clearing of a throat might as well have been a gunshot with how fast the class shut up. I'm quite sure many of you are rightly confused as to who I am and what I am, so let me answer both at once. I am Nizu, principal of UA, but what am I? Ask. A bear, a dog, a mouse, you choose. The principal of UA? Doesn't that mean he's Zawa's and Hisashi's boss? What's he doing here of all schools? The sound of a stool scraping the ground could be heard, and soon enough the whole class could see Nizu in all his glory. He stood there precariously for a moment before finding his balance and continuing on with his introduction. I won't be here for long today, but I did want to give a short encouragement for your current and future selves. He scanned the room, black beady eyes locking eyes with certain students in particular. No matter who you are or what quirk you have, UA has now officially changed its rules to be completely open, so even a quirkless individual may enter. I know this would be something to look forward to in a few years, but I feel that encouraging the youth early is very beneficial to my point. Not everyone has a good quirk, but not everyone has a bad quirk either. It doesn't matter what quirk you have or don't have, what you do with that quirk is what gives it value. So no matter where you want your life to take you, don't let something as trivial as a quirk stop you. There will always be barriers and obstacles that slow you down, but your job is to adapt and move forward no matter how difficult it may be. Furthermore, speaking from personal experience, you will meet many people who try to shut you down and demote you into something you don't want to be. Push up, Reach for a ledge on a cliff face above the obstacles they put in your way. Then, once you've surpassed them, the climb will be much easier thereon. I know you all are still quite young, and have big lives to live ahead of you, so before I go I must ask you one last thing. Respect each other. Do not become one another's obstacles, rather be the helping hands and guide each other to where you need to be. There was a slight scoff from Bakugo, and one of the mouse's ears twitched. He looked directly at the boy, seemingly staring straight into his very soul. Bakugo looked away, shifting uncomfortably. Having made his point, the rat continued. That will be all from me, thank you for listening, I do hope you take what I've said to heart. Goodbye. And then the rat was gone. Izuku caught a flash of white in the corner of his eye, and turned just in time to see a small paw replacing the air vent cover that was located on the floor. How Nizu had crossed the entire room that quickly, without any students except for Izuku noticing, the world may never know. Well, that was certainly educational, the teacher called from the front of class. Let's get started with today's lesson. Thus began the boring 6 hours of Izuku's weekday life. Walking home from school, Izuku couldn't help but feel like it had been a pretty decent day. Despite the whole sheet on a leaf debacle, it had gone smoothly, and he and his new friends connected even further. Nizu had been an unexpected surprise, but his speech had been quite inspiring, if Izuku was to be honest. He definitely had a newfound respect for the principal of UA after today. He could probably ask Aizawa later why Nizu was going around to schools personally instead of hiring someone or having faculty do it. It was a bit strange, the mammal was sure to be very busy, so going out of his way to talk to middle schoolers who wouldn't even be applying for high school for the next few years didn't seem to be the best use of time. Not that Izuku was complaining, he knew how it had lit a warm feeling in his chest, and when he'd looked at Himiko and Shinso, he'd seen the newfound confidence written all over them. The street rumbling drew him from his thoughts. Was there a villain fight nearby? He had to go see. He rushed down the street, following the sounds of a commotion. Looking around, he could tell that it was still a few streets over. He spotted a shortcut and turned to go down the deserted side street. Lost in the excitement of the moment, Izuku didn't even have time to react before it was too late. A cold sludge was working its way up his leg, rooting him to the spot. He panicked and tried to kick it off, but nothing was working. He looked around, spotting the source of the sludge, an open manhole a few feet away. The lid was cast haphazardly to the side, and a rising, larger pile of goop was rising from the depths. Is that a villain? You'll make a perfect skin suit for me to hide in, kid, the sludge said, voice gravelly. It lurched forward towards the boy, who was just standing there in horror. Definitely a villain. Snapping out of his stupor, Izuku desperately tried to get away with renewed vigor, flapping his wings and slashing at the goop with his claws. He looked around for anything that might help, a tool, a brick, anything. Please, I can't die here. The sludge was nearly fully encasing him now, invading Izuku's mouth when he opened it to scream for help. The sludge burned as it made its way down his throat. Izuku couldn't breathe. This only caused him to thrash further though, there had to be a way out. Don't worry, I'm just taking over your body. Don't worry my butt. How would you feel? It'll be easier for both of us if you don't fight back. It'll only hurt for a minute, you'll feel better soon. Right, I'll definitely feel better being a puppet. No matter how much Izuku moved around, trying to escape, it only seemed to amuse the villain further. Grab all you want, he chuckled. My body's made of fluid. Izuku was running out of air. His head was pounding and his lungs burned with the need for oxygen. His attempts to break free grew weaker, less frequent. The slime noticed this. Thanks for the help. You're a real hero to me, kid. Through his darkening vision, he saw the silhouette of a large figure jump out of the manhole and land in front of the villain. Have no fear, you're safe. Now that I am here, that is. All Might is here. Okay, brain, don't fail me now if you fail me. Now I will get you lobotomized. Your one job is to stay awake. So we can meet All Might. Don't make me lobotomize you. Why the hell am I talking to an organ? The sludge villain yelped as All Might threw the manhole cover right through it. Lunging forward, the hero blocked the villain as it tried to escape, forming an indestructible wall of pure muscle. All Might readied himself, adjusting his stance and bringing a fist back. Texas. Smash. I can die happy. A surge of wind flew through the street, hitting the villain and Izuku right where they stood. The sludge was sent flying into a million different pieces, but Izuku, being a normal human, flew several feet into the air before falling heavily onto the ground in a heap. Hey! Wake up! Tash! A slap to the face was the first thing Izuku registered before shooting up from the ground. Thought we lost you there. All Izuku could do was gape at the man in front of him, his hero, his idol. And he'd just been saved from an actual, real-life villain, by none other than All Might. You must be in shock. Is there anything else a great hero such as myself could do for you? Perhaps sign something? Weiss, let me get my notebook. He scrambled to get up and move to his backpack. Remembering his manners, thank you, All Might sir. Of course, my boy. Handing over one of his notebooks to All might be one of the single most amazing experiences of Izuku's life. His hand. All Might's. This is my new favorite hand. I guess I'm a lefty now. While All Might was signing his book, Izuku checked himself over really quick. Nothing seemed to be off, but a few of his feathers seemed loose. He reached up to pluck them out, but before he could, All Might moved the notebook back at him. All done. Izuku accepted the notebook, thanking his idol again. All right, boy, I'd best be going now, but good luck to you. Stay out of trouble though, dealing with villains is a hero's job, not some random kid's. He let out a booming laugh that was followed with his blinding signature grin. Izuku let out a shaky smile, kind of off-put by the strange reaction he'd gotten by the hero. All Might bent down, checking his boots and wiping off from his feet. There was a golden flash and... Was that my feather? Did he just swipe my feather? Hey wait, that was Dash. But All Might was already gone, bounding away, several rooftops over now. There was no FING way that just happened. Izuku looked at his wings, and sure enough that loose feather was no longer there. The wind must have blown it off while I was focused on All Might. Then he picked it off of the ground, and I only noticed because the light caught on it. Never meet your heroes, I guess. Groaning, Izuku wondered what he would do now. There was always at least one feather that fell off per week. If he didn't present it to Inko, she would assume he was hiding them from her, and then he was in for a whole world of trouble that he really did not want to deal with right now. Today had had enough out of the ordinary experiences to last Izuku for a few years. Not ready to deal with home quite yet, he decided to take the long way back to his house. It was nothing crazy, but a few extra minutes of peace and quiet never hurt. He made his way back to a more densely populated street, but by now the fight from before was long over. All that was left was chunks of concrete and yellow tape blocking civilians from entering a crumbling building. Izuku trudged down the streets, praying to whatever entity that may watch over him that this night ended okay. He stopped once again, however, when yet another fight could be heard a little ways down the street. 2 in one day? Plus the sludge that attacked me? Strange. But Izuku had time to kill, and he wasn't going to let this opportunity go to waste. Picking up his pace, he quickly approached the crowd of heroes and people standing from afar. As he got closer, he could see the familiar blob of the sludge villain. Didn't All Might take care of it? How did it get out? And why are these heroes just standing around? Struggling in the villain's hold was none other than Bakugo Katsuki. If this was a hostage situation, then sure, certain heroes couldn't attack for fear of injuring the boy, but plenty of them had quirks that could help. So why are they all just standing there like useless ornaments? Bakugo was clearly struggling with the villain, much like Izuku had only minutes before. He knew that Bakugo only had a few seconds left of consciousness, especially since he'd been like that since before Izuku had gotten there. Somebody had to do something, or he could get seriously hurt. If nobody else is brave enough or strong enough to do what's right, then it's up to you to do it for them. That's what Aizawa had said. It was one of the first training sessions Izuku had ever had with him, and Aizawa saw fit to teach him what being a hero was truly all about. Not what the media portrayed it as, not what his own childish imagination saw it as, but the real thing. That's what it narrowed down to. In the moment, all that mattered was a fighting spirit and the ability to do what was right. If I want to be a hero someday, how could I just stand around like this? He had to do something and he had to do it fast. Izuku knew that time was limited, that Bakugo would probably suffocate to death if he wasn't released from the villain's hold soon. And since these heroes weren't doing anything, well, no one could put blame on a random animal, right? He ducked past a few people and hid out of sight behind a nearby car, the polished red SUV blocking him fully from sight. Go time. He shifted, and without wasting a beat, was sprinting back to the barricade, powerful body shifting with every stride. People screamed as he shot by, frightened by the large feline he had become. He bypassed the heroes without a second thought, and they only realized what had happened after he was out of the range. Hey, stop. Somebody catch that panther. It's a jaguar, stupid. What? Izuku pushed that very intelligent conversation to the back of his mind, only focusing on the boy and villain in front of him. He crouched a few feet away, just watching and waiting. The sludge said that it was made up of liquid, so attacking it head-on would be useless. There must be some weakness though. His gaze drifted to the two large eyes that, now that Izuku thought about it, was glaringly obvious. Gotcha. The slime had noticed Izuku by now, and was backing away from him while keeping distance from the heroes. Good kitty. Stay right there. Izuku growled, and took a few steps back before racing forward, gaining enough momentum to leap up, claws extended. At the same time, he slashed one of the villain's eyes and knocked Bakugo out of his hold. The villain shrieked, and while it was stunned, the previously dormant heroes leapt into action, finishing the job. Izuku grabbed a barely conscious Bakugo by the collar of his shirt and picked him up like a little kitten, using momentum to swing him up onto his back. Bakugo grunted when he landed, but righted himself with what little strength he had left, grabbing whatever fur he could find. The hell has gone on? He slurred, clearly out of it. Izuku just let out a little rumble before taking a few steps, allowing Bakugo to get used to the feeling. Once he seemed accustomed, Izuku started moving faster, trying to get away from the heroes but also move Bakugo to a place where he could get some medical help. The heroes nearby definitely saw what was happening, but let it go because it wasn't their main priority, the villain was. The crowd cheered as Izuku approached, excited to see that the mysterious feline who'd saved the day was now carrying back the hostage. Izuku leapt over a final piece of rubble, then deposited Bakugo to a few paramedics who put him on a stretcher. Right as he turned to leave, a camera was shoved in his face. Excuse me. You are a person, right? Please, turn back so we can ask you a few questions. The reporter got even closer, so Izuku backed away, ready to run. Or maybe an animal with a quirk. Quick, nod if you can understand me. Ears back, Izuku growled a warning, loud and clear. The reporter froze, looking more nervous now. Good kitty. When he growled again, stronger this time, only then did the paparazzi start backing off. They gave him space and, more importantly, an exit. He took off, nearly bowling two people over who got too close. He ran like that all the way home, not stopping to breathe even once for fear that he might be caught. Once he reached his block, only then he slowed. Now that he'd calmed, the true weight of what he'd done hit him. On the one hand, he'd done hero work. On the other hand, he'd done hero work without a license and full use of a quirk. No matter how much he might try to gaslight himself into saying that it had a good reason, which it did, in the eyes of the law, he had just committed the act known as vigilantism. Never had Izuku ever been more grateful for the fact that his parents did not watch the news. He might actually get skinned alive if they knew that he had put himself in danger like that, no matter what the cause may have been. Izuku stopped in front of his house, listening to the sounds inside with his enhanced ears. He deemed it safe enough, so he switched from his jaguar form to his human one, and the familiar weight of his wings returning was comforting. Taking a deep breath, Izuku walked inside. Izuku, come here. His mother's voice called out to where Izuku was resting comfortably on his bed. He'd gotten home hours ago, but still had a couple hours until he would go to bed. He pushed off his sheets and went out to meet her where she was in the living room. The smell of dinner still lingered faintly in the air, along with the candle Hisashi had left on the dinner table. Speaking of Hisashi, he was seated on the couch, looking at Izuku with a carefully blank expression. Your father wants to talk to you, Izuku. Please don't make this dramatic. Inko sat next to Hisashi, speaking to Izuku as one might speak to a small child. A cold chill went down his spine, but he ignored the instinct to run, instead taking a seat in front of the low coffee table by his parents' feet. Due to your inability to provide feathers at a steady pace, I have a solution to that problem. Hisashi motioned to Izuku. Hold out a hand, please. Izuku obliged, more nervous by the second. Hisashi pulled a strange tool out from behind him, presenting it to Izuku before lowering it to his extended hand. This is a jewel cutter. Oh boy, here we go. I plan on getting a more high-tech one if this goes well, but for now this will have to do. All I need to do is file off a few fingernails. It's just like I'm cutting your nails when they've grown too long, nothing permanent. Izuku shifted, not knowing how he felt about this, but also knowing he didn't really have a choice. Now, lengthen your nails as much as you can and make them gold for now. He did as he was told, and they gleamed in the lamplight. But, hold still. The first nail was pretty easy, the long end had snapped off without a fuss. It was probably due to the malleable nature of the gold Izuku had made his claws into. Up until the last nail, it only got more difficult. With Izuku's anxiety rising, he was unconsciously making each nail harder and harder than the last. When the last nail came off, it did not come off clean. With a sickening sichke, it fractured all the way to Izuku's nail bed. Thankfully it was only his pinky, but it still hurt like hell, especially when Hisashi pulled the gold away. The wound started bleeding almost immediately, so Izuku grabbed a tissue from the coffee table and pressed it to his finger. Alright. Other hand. His father looked at him expectantly, but Izuku stopped for a moment. Hang on. Hisashi raised an eyebrow, but let him continue. If you do both hands, I won't be able to protect myself. Then, getting bolder, plus, won't people notice if all my claws are clipped? I can make up an excuse for one hand, but both is less believable. Hisashi seemed to debate this for a moment before reluctantly putting the tool down. But I don't want any funny business out of you, he said before fixing Izuku with a hard stare. Izuku nodded before turning and leaving the room. He immediately heard Inko's voice talking to her husband in hushed whispers. He didn't eavesdrop, he was tired. When Izuku reached his room, all he did before flopping into bed was put on some pajamas and bandage his finger. His school responsibilities would have to wait. With a brush of his hand, he flicked off the light.